Clara did not cry when they left her in the hall. She had learned long ago that tears did not change anything in the Whitmore house. They did not soften her mother's sharp eyes, or loosen the tight grip her family kept on who mattered and who did not. Tears were for people who still believed things could be different. Clara had moved past that particular kind of hope years ago. So she stood in the corridor outside the grand ballroom, her back straight, her chin level, wearing a dress that had belonged to someone else in a season that had already passed, and she did not cry. The dress was gray, not silver, not ash, not the kind of gray that catches light and turns into something beautiful. It was plain, honest, ordinary gray, the kind that disappears against walls and stone floors. Her sister Eleanor had chosen it from the back of a wardrobe that morning, holding it up with 2 fingers, as if it were something she had found on the street, and she had said, very simply, "This will do for you." And that had been the end of the conversation. There had been no maid assigned to Clara that morning. Every other woman in the Whitmore household had someone helping them. Her mother had 2. Eleanor had 3. Even the distant cousin visiting from the countryside had been given someone to pin her hair. Clara had stood at the small mirror in her room and done what she could with her own hands. She had brushed her dark hair smooth and pinned it simply at the back of her neck. She had pressed the gray dress herself, heating the iron carefully so as not to scorch the fabric. She had fastened her own buttons, and when she had looked at herself in the glass before coming downstairs, she had not seen someone ruined or undone. She had seen herself. Quiet, clear-eyed, composed. Her mother had glanced at her once when she appeared at the top of the stairs. Just once. Then she had turned back to the mirror in the hallway and adjusted the pearl earrings at her ears and said, without looking up, "Stay in the corridor. If anyone asks, you are waiting for a message." Then she had swept through the ballroom doors with Eleanor on her arm, and the doors had closed behind them, and Clara had been left in the hall. The hall was long and lit with wall lanterns that flickered in a slow rhythm, as if breathing. The floor was polished marble that reflected the light in soft amber pools. Along one side, tall windows looked out onto the garden, where small lanterns had been strung between the hedges, burning orange and gold in the autumn dark. It was a beautiful night. Clara could admit that, at least. Whatever was being taken from her this evening, the night itself was beautiful. She could hear music through the doors, a string quartet playing something light and elegant, the kind of music that made people feel as if life were graceful and easy and meant to be enjoyed. She could hear voices rising and falling, laughter, the sound of heels on a dance floor. She had imagined attending a gathering like this one for a long time, not because she wanted to be seen or admired, simply because she had wanted to be present, to be part of an evening, to exist in a room where people were happy. But she was here, in the corridor, and not there. She had brought a book. She always brought a book. It was a small habit that had started when she was about 12 years old and had first realized that the adults around her frequently forgot she existed. In the beginning, she had felt the hurt of it deeply, the way children do, sharply and physically, like something pressing against the chest. But she had also discovered that in the spaces where no one was watching her, she could do exactly as she pleased. She could sit quietly in a corner of the house and read without anyone telling her to be somewhere else, or do something useful, or smile at someone she did not know. Invisibility had its costs, but it also had its freedoms, and Clara had learned to value both, honestly. She had pulled the book from the small bag she carried and opened it to the page she had marked. It was a collection of essays on philosophy and the nature of human justice. Not the kind of reading her mother would have approved of. Her mother believed firmly that young women should occupy their minds with practical things, with household matters, with the kind of careful social thinking that kept a family in good standing. Philosophy was not practical. Philosophy asked questions that made people uncomfortable. Clara found those questions the most interesting kind. The corridor was mostly quiet. Servants moved through it occasionally, carrying trays and covered dishes, nodding briefly at Clara as they passed. She nodded back with the same courtesy she gave to everyone. One of the older kitchen women, a round-faced woman named Agnes who had been with the household for over 20 years, paused near Clara on her third pass and looked at her with something steady and kind in her expression. "Miss Clara," Agnes said quietly, "you should have something warm. It is a long evening." "I am fine, Agnes. Thank you." Agnes pressed her lips together, looked once at the closed ballroom doors, and then looked back at Clara. She said nothing more. But before she moved on, she set down a small cup of tea on the side table, near the alcove where Clara stood. Clara thanked her again, genuinely, and Agnes disappeared back into the kitchen corridor without another word. Clara picked up the tea and held the warm cup between both hands and went back to her book. She was not performing stoicism. She was not holding herself rigid and brave while fighting down waves of pain and anger. She had done that in the past, years ago, in the earlier days, when her mother's choices had still surprised her. But surprise had faded a long time since. What remained was something quieter and harder to name. Not acceptance exactly, more like clarity. She could see the situation as it was, without the fog of hoping it might be otherwise. She had been left in the hall. Her family was in the ballroom. The evening would pass, and eventually someone would come out and tell her it was time to go home, and she would go. What she had not accounted for was the Duke. She had not been thinking about him. She had not been thinking about any of the people inside. She had been deep in her book, turning a particular argument over in her mind, disagreeing with the author's reasoning on one important point, and working out why, when she heard footsteps in the corridor that were different from the rhythm of the servants. They were measured and unhurried. Not the quick, efficient steps of someone carrying something, not the precise clicking steps of a woman in formal heels. These were the steps of someone walking because they chose to, without urgency, without a particular destination in mind. Clara did not look up immediately. She finished the sentence she was reading, as she always did. She had a rule about sentences. You finished them before you looked away. It was a small rule, but she had found that small rules kept the shape of a day intact when everything else felt uncertain. When she did look up, she saw a man who was perhaps 30 years old, maybe slightly more, standing about 6 feet from her in the corridor. He was not what she would have called a remarkable-looking person, not in the way that people sometimes are when they seem designed to be stared at. He was simply well-made. Dark hair, calm brown eyes, a face that looked as if it had spent time outdoors and had not minded. He was dressed formally, as all the men at this gathering were, but there was something in the way he wore his clothes that suggested he had put them on without much thought, that they were simply what was required, not something he had chosen for pleasure. He had stopped walking when he saw her. She could see him recalibrating slightly, the way a person does when they encounter something they had not expected. He had probably come into the corridor for quiet, or air, or to be away from the noise of the ballroom for a few minutes. He had not expected to find someone standing in an alcove reading a book. Clara held his gaze evenly. She did not smile nervously, or drop her eyes, or straighten herself into a more acceptable posture. She simply looked at him the way she looked at everything, with open, calm attention. He spoke first. "Good evening," he said. "Good evening," she replied. There was a brief pause, not an uncomfortable one, more the kind of pause that exists when two people are deciding whether to leave the moment exactly as it is, or step into it. He took one slow step closer and tilted his head slightly toward the book in her hands. "Philosophy?" he said. She glanced down at the cover, then back at him. "Essays on Justice," she said. "I disagree with the author on his third argument." He looked at her with what she could only describe as genuine interest, not polite interest, the kind people perform when they are trying to seem engaged. Real interest, the kind that sharpens the eyes slightly and stills the rest of the body. "Which argument?" he asked. And that was how it began. She had not known, in that moment, who he was. She had not recognized him from descriptions or portraits, or the social conversation that filled the household before a grand gathering. She had simply seen a man in a corridor who had asked her a genuine question and was waiting, with real patience, for her genuine answer. She told him. She told him which argument she disagreed with, and she told him why, and she watched him listen in the way that very few people ever listened, not waiting for a gap in which to speak, but actually taking in what she said and turning it over before he responded. And when he responded, he did not simply agree with her to be agreeable. He pushed back on one point, steadily and with clear reasoning, and she found herself thinking harder, searching for the better answer. The corridor flickered quietly around them. The music played on behind the closed doors. The autumn night pressed gently against the tall windows, and Clara Whitmore stood in her plain gray dress with her cup of cooling tea on the table beside her, and had the most interesting conversation she had experienced in a very long time. She did not know yet what was coming. She did not know that everything her family had built and planned and arranged would begin to shift because of this night, this hall, this quiet exchange between two people in a corridor, while the rest of the world danced behind closed doors. She only knew that when he asked her name, she told him simply, without any of the careful social framing her mother had trained Eleanor to use, without titles or family references or strategic positioning. "Clara," she said, "Clara Whitmore." And he nodded slowly, as if the name fit something he had already been thinking. "Edmund Voss," he said. She did not react, because she did not know the name. She simply nodded in return, with the same quiet courtesy she gave to everyone. Later, she would understand what that name meant. Later, she would understand that the man standing in the corridor with her, asking about philosophy and listening with his whole attention, was the man the entire gathering inside had been arranged around. The man every family in the room had dressed their daughters carefully to impress. The man her mother had spoken about in low, urgent tones for the past 3 weeks. But in that moment, in the flickering amber light of the corridor, she did not know, and so she spoke to him freely, honestly, without armor or calculation, the way she had spoken to almost no one in years. And he, for his part, kept listening, as if he had nowhere in the world he needed to be. The evening outside continued. Carriages passed. The garden lanterns burned low and orange. Inside the ballroom, the music changed, and the dancing continued, and the carefully arranged world moved through its careful paces. And in the hall, something else entirely was beginning. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being around people who look through you. Clara Whitmore had lived inside that particular loneliness for most of her life, not because she was unloved by everyone, but because the people nearest to her, the ones who should have seen her most clearly, had decided a long time ago that she was not the one worth seeing. She had grown up in the same house as Eleanor, slept down the hall from her, eaten at the same table, shared the same family name, and yet from her earliest memory, there had always been a difference in how the world of that house arranged itself around the two of them. Eleanor was the sun, Clara was the window, useful for letting in light, easily overlooked once you were already warm. People sometimes assumed that Clara must have been bitter about this, that she must have spent her younger years in quiet rage, watching her sister receive everything, while she received the remainder, but it had not been quite like that. The truth was more complicated, and less dramatic, as truth usually is. Eleanor was genuinely beautiful. That was not Clara's jealousy speaking, it was simply accurate. Eleanor had fine golden hair that curled perfectly without assistance, wide blue eyes that people described as striking, and a face that was arranged in the particular way that made strangers stop and look. She also had charm, the easy social kind that made people feel noticed and warm in her company. She moved through rooms as if they had been built for her. She laughed at the right moments. She remembered names. She made the people around her feel important. Clara, on the other hand, was what people called quietly pretty, which was a phrase that meant they had noticed she was not plain, but had then moved on to thinking about something else. Her hair was dark and straight. Her eyes were green, which her mother had once said was a difficult color, neither here nor there. She was neither short nor tall. She did not fill a room with her presence, and she had never wanted to. What Clara had was something different, something that is harder to name in a world that prizes surfaces. She had depth, not the performed depth of someone who wants to appear thoughtful. Actual depth, the kind that comes from years of sitting quietly in corners, and observing, and reading, and thinking, from being the person no one is watching closely enough to guard themselves around. She had seen her family and her world very clearly, for a very long time, and it had given her a kind of understanding that most people her age had not yet developed. But understanding your situation and finding it comfortable are two entirely different things, and there were still nights when Clara lay in her room and felt the weight of being overlooked pressing on her chest like something solid. The Whitmore family had not always been what they were now. There had been better years, her mother often said, though she said it with a particular kind of carefully controlled emotion that Clara recognized as grief dressed up as nostalgia. There had been a time when the Whitmore name carried real weight, when the family house was fully staffed, and the social invitations came without effort, and the money did not need to be counted and recounted before any decision was made. That time had passed before Clara was old enough to remember it clearly. What she remembered was her father, who had been a gentleman, a reader, someone who laughed easily and thought carefully, who had died when Clara was 9 years old and Eleanor was 13. His death had changed the household in ways that rippled through every year that followed. The money had become tighter. The staff had shrunk. The social position of the family, which depended so heavily on appearance and confidence, had begun to require active maintenance in a way it never had before. Her mother, whose name was Frances, had responded to all of this by becoming a woman of strategy. Frances Whitmore was not cruel, or at least Clara did not think of her that way. She was practical, in the way that people become when they believe survival depends on practicality. She had looked at her 2 daughters, and she had made a calculation that she had never tried to hide, not from Eleanor, and not from Clara. Eleanor was the family's best possibility. Eleanor could marry well. Eleanor had the looks and the manner and the training for it. If Eleanor could be placed in the right rooms, introduced to the right people, presented with the right care, then the family's position could be secured. A good marriage for Eleanor would mean safety for all of them. Clara, in her mother's honest estimation, was not the one for that task. This was not said with malice. It was said the way someone says the weather will be difficult or the road will be long. It was said as a fact. And facts, in Frances Whitmore's world, were things you arranged your life around, not things you argued with. So Eleanor had been given the lessons, the dancing tutor, the language lessons, the careful instruction in how to enter a room and how to leave it, how to address someone above your station and how to manage someone below it. Eleanor had been given the dresses, because a young woman being prepared for a certain kind of life needed to look a certain kind of way. Eleanor had been given the introductions, the careful social placements, the early appearances at small gatherings, designed to build toward larger ones. Clara had been given books. This was not entirely without thought. Frances had recognized, even if she had not named it openly, that her younger daughter had a serious mind, and that a serious mind needed something to work on, or it became difficult, and books were inexpensive. So Clara had books, and she had the run of the small house library, and she had the freedom that comes from being the person no one is watching carefully. She had read everything in that library twice, some things 3 times. She had moved from stories into essays, from essays into philosophy, from philosophy into science and history, and the kind of careful argument about ideas that her mother would have found alarming if she had known about it. She had developed opinions, clear ones, well-reasoned ones, opinions that she had tested against the books and found solid. She had no one to talk to about them. That was the particular loneliness of Clara's situation, not the lack of dresses or the absence of dancing lessons or the way she was placed at the far end of the table when important guests came to dinner. Those things she had made her peace with, more or less. What she could not quite make her peace with was having a mind that was busy and alive and full of things to say, and having almost no one around her who wanted to hear them. Agnes from the kitchen listened to her sometimes, in a kind and patient way, though Agnes was honest enough to say she did not follow the philosophical parts. One of the young housemaids, a girl called Penny who had grown up in a village nearby, would sometimes sit with Clara in the garden and listen to her talk about whatever she had been reading, nodding with great seriousness, even when she did not understand it. Clara valued Penny's company more than Penny probably knew. But there was no one in Clara's life who could actually engage with her, who could listen and then push back and then listen again, who could take an idea she offered and turn it over and examine it and hand it back changed. Until the corridor. She had not been thinking about conversation when she took her position in the hall that evening. She had been thinking about the essay she had been reading all afternoon, the one she disagreed with, turning the argument over and over the way she did with things that bothered her, until she found the exact place where it went wrong. The man who had stopped in the corridor, Edmund Voss, had listened to her, the way no one had ever quite listened to her before. After they had introduced themselves and he had asked about the book, and she had told him about the argument she disagreed with, and he had listened and then responded, they had moved, quite naturally, without either of them arranging it, into something that felt like a real conversation. Not a polite exchange, not the kind of back and forth that people perform at social gatherings, the kind where both people are waiting for their turn to speak, something more genuine than that. He had challenged her reasoning at one point, not harshly, but clearly. He had said that her objection to the author's third argument assumed a particular definition of justice that was not the only available definition, and that if she expanded her definition, the argument held better than she was giving it credit for. She had thought about that. She had not simply accepted it because he had said it confidently. She had held it up against her own thinking and tested it, and then she had told him what she found. "You may be right that I am working from a narrower definition," she had said, "but I think the author himself is working from the same narrow definition, because his earlier arguments only make sense within it. So if I accept your expanded definition, the problem doesn't go away, it moves." He had been quiet for a moment. Then he had said, "That is a better answer than I expected." She had looked at him steadily. "Should I have given you a worse one?" He had laughed then, a real laugh, not the polished social kind that she heard from men in drawing rooms when they were performing enjoyment, a genuine one. "No," he said. "That is exactly the right answer." They had continued from there. She had not been nervous around him. That surprised her a little, looking back on it. Most of the young women she knew would have been intensely conscious of a man like this, standing in front of them, would have been thinking about how they appeared and what impression they were making and whether they were saying the right things. Clara found that she was simply thinking about the conversation, about the ideas, about what he was saying and what she actually thought in response to it. She supposed that was what happened when you stopped caring about performing and started caring about thinking. He had stayed in the corridor for longer than either of them had planned. She could not have said afterward exactly how much time passed, because she had stopped noticing it. The evening outside the windows deepened. The lanterns in the garden burned lower. The sounds from behind the ballroom doors changed in rhythm as the program of the evening moved through its stages. And through all of it, she had stood in her plain gray dress and talked about ideas with a man she had only just met, and she had felt more present and more alive than she had felt in months. She had not yet understood what it meant that he was still there, that he had not gone back inside after a few polite minutes, that he kept asking her questions and kept listening carefully to her answers and kept finding new angles to push her thinking from. She had not yet connected that particular fact to anything larger. She was simply there, in the conversation, fully. And he was there too, in the same way. Not half attending while thinking of where else to be, not managing her, just there, in the corridor, with the amber light and the faint music and the night outside, thinking alongside her, the way she had always wanted someone to think alongside her. There were people behind those doors who had spent weeks preparing to meet Edmund Voss, who had practiced their smiles and rehearsed their topics, and selected their dresses with exquisite care, who had placed themselves in the exact right position, in the exact right room, to be seen by him at the right moment. Clara had done none of those things. She had stood in the hall because she was told to, and had opened her book because that was what she always did. And the Duke had found her anyway. Not because he had been looking, but because she was exactly, entirely, genuinely herself, in a night full of performances, and something in that had stopped him in a corridor, and made him ask a question, and made him stay. She simply stood in the amber light and thought about justice, and answered his questions honestly. And the evening moved on around her, as evenings do, carrying everything with it into the next thing. The card arrived on a Tuesday morning, before the household had finished breakfast. Clara was in the kitchen, helping Agnes shell a bowl of dried beans, because it was the kind of task she found calming, the repetitive motion of it, the soft sound of the beans dropping into the pot. She liked the kitchen in the mornings. It smelled of bread and wood smoke, and was the warmest room in the house. Agnes moved around her with the comfortable ease of someone who had accepted long ago that Clara would appear here in the early hours, and that the world had not ended as a result. The housekeeper, a tall and precise woman named Mrs. Doyle, appeared in the kitchen doorway holding a small silver tray, as if it were something she did not entirely trust. "Miss Clara," Mrs. Doyle said, with the particular tone she used when something had happened that she was not sure how to present. "There is a calling card." Clara looked up from the beans. "For my mother?" "It is addressed to you, miss." The kitchen went very quiet. Agnes set down her spoon. Mrs. Doyle walked the tray to Clara with great formality, and Clara looked at the card on it. It was cream-colored and heavy, the kind of card that comes from good paper made by people who take paper seriously. The name printed on it was Edmund Voss, and beneath the name In a different and more ordinary hand, someone had written a few words. They requested the honor of a formal visit, if Miss Clara Whitmore were agreeable, at a time convenient to her and her family. Clara read it twice. Then she set it back on the tray and went back to the beans. "Miss Clara," Mrs. Doyle said, in a tone that suggested she felt this response was inadequate. "Please let my mother know," Clara said. That was sufficient to send Mrs. Doyle down the corridor with some urgency. Clara heard her mother's voice from the breakfast room a few seconds later, a sharp, climbing sound that meant Frances Whitmore had been surprised. Clara did not hear Eleanor's response. She imagined it was quieter. She finished the beans and washed her hands and dried them on a cloth and went through to the breakfast room to face whatever was coming. Frances Whitmore was standing at the window with the calling card in one hand and a look on her face that Clara had never quite seen before. It was not pleasure exactly, though there was something in it that wanted to be pleasure. It was more like someone doing rapid calculations in their head while their expression tried to hold steady and failed slightly. Eleanor was sitting at the breakfast table, a cup of tea in front of her that she was not drinking. Her face was arranged in a way that Clara recognized as controlled, the particular blankness Eleanor wore when she was feeling something she did not want to show. "Did you know?" their mother said, without turning from the window. "Did I know what?" "About this." Frances lifted the card without looking at it. "About him. About any of it." "I spoke to a man in the corridor," Clara said. "I did not know who he was." Her mother turned then. Her eyes were sharp and very clear, and moving over Clara, in the way that Clara had grown used to, the way that was searching for something, and was also somehow not quite seeing the thing that was in front of it. "You spoke to the Duke of Ashford," Frances said, in the corridor, "for 40 minutes, without knowing who he was." "He was interesting," Clara said simply. Eleanor made a small sound that was not quite a laugh, and not quite anything else. Frances set the card down on the table and pressed her fingers flat against the surface and was quiet for a long moment. Clara watched her and waited, because she had learned that the best response to her mother's silences was patience. Frances was not a stupid woman. She was working through something, and whatever she arrived at would be more manageable than whatever she might say while she was still mid-calculation. "He has asked for a formal visit," Frances said finally. "Yes. To you." "Yes." Another silence. Frances picked up the card again and read it once more, though she had clearly read it several times already. Then she set it down again. "You will need a new dress," she said. Clara looked at her mother for a long moment. She thought about the gray dress. She thought about the corridor, and the evening, and Agnes's cup of tea, and the way the garden lanterns had looked through the tall windows. She thought about all the things that had not been given to her over the years, and the way those absences had nonetheless shaped her into the person who had stood in that corridor last night and spoken honestly to a man who had listened. She did not say any of this. She said, "I can manage with what I have." "You will have a new dress," her mother said, in a tone that was not offering something, but declaring it. Clara simply nodded. Eleanor stood from the table at that point, quietly, with the same precision she brought to everything. She carried her cup to the sideboard and set it down and said, "Excuse me," and left the room without looking at anyone. Her back was very straight, and her steps were even and measured. The door closed softly behind her. Frances looked at the door for a moment, after Eleanor had gone through it. Something moved through her expression that might have been regret, or something near to it, but it passed quickly, because Frances Whitmore was not someone who stayed long in feelings that could not be made useful. She turned back to Clara. "You will receive him properly," she said, "with courtesy and with care. You will not say anything peculiar." Clara tilted her head slightly. "What do you mean by peculiar?" "You know what I mean." "I spoke to him about a philosophy essay," Clara said. "He seemed to find it engaging rather than peculiar." Her mother gave her a long look that contained several different things layered inside it. Surprise was one of them, Clara thought. Something else too, something that might have been the edge of respect, though Frances would likely have refused to name it as such. "Then perhaps it was not peculiar in this instance," her mother said finally. "But be thoughtful. I am always thoughtful." "Be careful then." "Of what, exactly?" Frances Whitmore picked up her own teacup and wrapped both hands around it and looked out the window at the garden, which was gray with morning light and frost at the edges. "Of hoping," she said, very quietly. Then she seemed to decide she had said too much, or perhaps too little, and she straightened her back, and her expression settled back into its usual careful lines, and she said, "Mrs. Doyle will respond to the card today. We will arrange Thursday." And that was the end of the conversation. Clara walked back to the kitchen, where Agnes was stirring something at the stove. Agnes looked up when she came in, and did not say anything, but raised her eyebrows in the particular way she had, which asked everything without requiring a word. "Thursday," Clara said. Agnes nodded slowly, as if this were not entirely surprising, and went back to stirring. Clara sat at the kitchen table and thought. She thought about what it meant that Edmund Voss had sent a card. She thought about their conversation, and whether it had been what she thought it was, a real exchange between two people who found each other interesting, or whether she had misread it somehow, had given it more weight than it deserved. She was not someone who assumed the best about her own position in any situation. She had been wrong before about what things meant, or rather she had learned to be very careful about attaching meaning to events before she had more information. But the card was real. The words on it were clear. He had asked for a formal visit, not through her mother, or through social convention, but addressed specifically to Clara Whitmore. She did not know what to do with that yet, so she did what she always did, with things she did not know what to do with. She thought about it carefully, and set it aside for later, when she had more to think with. The days between Tuesday and Thursday moved slowly, which Clara attributed to the atmosphere in the house more than to any clock. Her mother was occupied with preparation, with speaking to Mrs. Doyle about the drawing room, and the arrangement of furniture, and the proper refreshments, with determining the correct level of formality for a first formal visit from a man of Edmund Voss's position. Eleanor moved through the house quietly, doing the things she usually did, with a composure so complete that it was itself a kind of statement. Clara watched her sister when she could do so without being obvious about it. She had known Eleanor for all of her life, and she understood her more fully, she suspected, than Eleanor would have liked. She could see the effort it cost Eleanor to be composed right now. She could see it in the slight tightness around Eleanor's eyes, and the way she sat when she sat alone, very still, the kind of stillness that was being maintained rather than natural. On Wednesday afternoon, Clara found Eleanor in the garden, standing near the old apple tree at the far end, where the branches hung low, and created a kind of sheltered space. Eleanor was not doing anything in particular. She was simply standing, with her arms folded and her face turned away from the house. Clara had not planned to approach her, but she did. She came to stand a few feet from her sister, and did not say anything for a moment, only stood beside her in the gray light of the November afternoon. Eleanor spoke first. "I had practiced," she said. Her voice was even. "I had practiced everything. What to say and how to say it. Which topics were safe and which were interesting. I had a whole plan." "I know," Clara said. "And you stood in the corridor and talked about a book." "Yes." Eleanor was quiet. A thrush moved through the branches above them, rustling, then settled. "I am not angry at you," Eleanor said, in a tone that suggested she was at least partly being honest about this, and partly working toward it. "I know," Clara said again. "I might be angry at the situation, which is not the same thing." "No," Clara agreed. "It is not." Eleanor turned then and looked at her, and Clara saw that her sister's face, under its careful composure, was tired. Not of physical tiredness, something older than that. "Were you frightened?" Eleanor asked. "When you found out who he was?" Clara thought about it honestly, as she always tried to think about things honestly. "A little," she said, "but not in the way I expected." "How then?" "I was not frightened that I had said the wrong thing. I was frightened that I had said exactly the right thing, and I would not be able to do that again." Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. Then something shifted very slightly in her expression, something that was not quite a smile, but was related to one. "That," Eleanor said slowly, "is the most like you thing you have ever said." Clara laughed, a small, genuine sound, and after a moment, Eleanor did too, and they stood together under the bare apple tree, while the November afternoon closed in around them, and it was, Clara thought, the most honest they had been with each other in a very long time. That evening, for the first time in years, they sat together in the upstairs sitting room after supper, and Eleanor read aloud from a novel, while Clara listened, and their mother sat in the armchair nearby with her sewing, and the house was quiet and warm, and almost, for a little while, like something Clara had always wanted it to be. She did not let herself think too far ahead. She did not build castles from calling cards. She was not that kind of person. But she fell asleep that night with the window cracked slightly open, and the cool autumn air moved through the room, and she lay in the dark and thought about a corridor, and a conversation, and a man who had listened to her with his whole attention, and she thought that whatever happened next, that had been real. The conversation had been real, the listening had been real, and whatever else was uncertain, she could hold on to that. Thursday arrived the way mornings do, when you have been waiting for them, with a plainness that makes the waiting seem excessive. The sky was flat gray, the garden still and cold, the house smelling of wood smoke, and the particular nervous quality of preparation. Clara dressed herself, as she always did, because no one had thought to assign her assistance even now. But this time, she was not dressing in whatever was left. Her mother had sent Mrs. Doyle out on Wednesday with money and instructions, and a dress had been returned that evening. A deep green wool, simple and well cut, without ornament or decoration but made from good material, by someone who understood how to construct a garment properly. Clara held it for a moment before she put it on. It was the first new dress she had been given in 3 years that was not a reworked version of something older, something of Eleanor's reshaped to fit. She put it on carefully. She did her hair simply, as she always did. She looked at herself in the glass and saw herself, just Clara, in a green dress that fit her properly, and that was enough. She went downstairs and sat in the drawing room and waited. He arrived exactly when he said he would. She heard the carriage on the drive, and heard Mrs. Doyle answer the door, and heard footsteps in the hall, and then the drawing room door opened, and Edmund Voss walked in, and stopped when he saw her, and the expression on his face was something that Clara would think about afterward, in the quiet of her room, with a careful and wondering attention. It was not the expression of a man who was pleasantly surprised to find a woman presentable. It was not the expression of someone completing a social obligation. It was quieter than either of those things and more serious. It was the expression of someone who had wanted something to be a certain way, and was relieved to find that it was. He said, "Good afternoon." She said it back. They sat down, and he refused the tea that Mrs. Doyle hovered with at the doorway, and after a moment, her mother excused herself with a murmured remark about something needing her attention in another room, which Clara suspected was not true, but was gracious regardless. And then they were nearly alone, Mrs. Doyle sitting at a precise distance with her sewing as was proper, and Edmund Voss looked at Clara with those calm brown eyes and said, "I thought about your argument." Clara felt something in her chest settle, like a key turning in a lock. "Did it hold?" she asked. "Mostly," he said. "One section needed revising." "Which section?" And just like that, as simply as breathing, they were back inside it, the kind of conversation that feels like the truest thing in the room, and Clara sat in her green dress in the drawing room of the house, where she had grown up invisible, and she was not invisible at all. She was entirely, completely present, and the afternoon light moved slowly through the windows, as November afternoons do, going gray before you expected it, and neither of them seemed to notice or mind. Frances Whitmore was not a woman who changed her mind slowly. When she changed it at all, she changed it completely, and you could see it happen in the moment it happened, like a window opening in a room that had been sealed shut. That window opened on the Saturday after Edmund's first formal visit. He had come again on the Friday. No card this time, no formal arrangement 2 days in advance. He had simply appeared at the door in the late morning and asked if Miss Clara was at home. Mrs. Doyle had come to find Clara in the library, where she was doing what she always did, reading, with her feet tucked under her, on the old green chair that had been in that room as long as she could remember. "Again?" Clara had said, which was not what Mrs. Doyle expected her to say, and which seemed to briefly unsettle the housekeeper's careful professional expression. "Yes, miss," Mrs. Doyle said. "Shall I say you are engaged?" Clara set a marker in her book, and stood up and smoothed her dress. "No," she said. "Tell him I will be a few minutes." She went to see him not because she felt she ought to, or because the situation required it, but because she wanted to, and she was honest enough with herself to know the difference between those two things. She wanted to talk to him again. It was as simple as that. He was in the drawing room when she came in. He had not sat down. He was standing at the window, looking out at the garden with his hands in his coat pockets, and when she came in, he turned around with the kind of ease that suggested he was comfortable in spaces he had just arrived in, which she suspected was either a product of his position or something older than that, something in his character. "I was passing," he said, which they both understood was not entirely the full truth. "Were you?" Clara said. "More or less," he allowed. Then, with something in his expression that was very close to direct, he said, "I wanted to return to something we left unresolved yesterday. The question of precedent." "Yes." She sat down. He sat down. And they went back into the argument, as if they had only paused it for the night, rather than ending it entirely. This was something Clara found remarkable about talking with Edmund Voss. Other conversations required a kind of reconstruction. You had to remind the other person what you had been discussing, recap the main points, ease back in carefully. With him, you could simply pick up the thread as if it had been lying there waiting, and it would be the same thread, nothing lost, nothing frayed. An hour passed, then another. At some point Mrs. Doyle brought tea, and neither of them mentioned it until it was cold, and then Clara noticed it, and poured it anyway, and handed him a cup without asking, which made him smile in a way that reached his eyes. Eleanor appeared in the doorway at one point, briefly, on some small and probably invented errand, and said good afternoon, in a voice that was entirely pleasant and entirely nothing else. And Edmund stood and bowed, and said good afternoon back, and Eleanor withdrew, and the conversation continued. Clara was aware of how much that had cost Eleanor, and she was grateful, quietly and fully, for the dignity of it. Her mother came in near the end of the second hour, to suggest that Edmund might wish to stay for lunch, which was an extraordinary departure from the usual order of things. Frances Whitmore did not offer lunch to visitors unexpectedly. She did not alter the household's arrangements on short notice. The fact that she was doing so now told Clara more clearly than anything else that her mother was recalibrating, rapidly and with determination. Edmund thanked her mother graciously and said he had another appointment, but would be honored another time. Frances received this with the kind of warmth that she usually reserved for people she had known for years, not for a man who had been in her drawing room for the second time in 2 days. After he left, Clara sat in the drawing room for a little while on her own. She was not doing anything in particular. She was thinking, which was what she generally did after things that needed thinking about. She was thinking about what was happening, not in the dreamy or romantic way that she associated with certain kinds of stories, where a young woman meets a man, and the world rearranges itself into a kind of warmth, and she stops thinking clearly. Clara was not built that way, and had never wanted to be. She was thinking carefully and honestly about the situation she was in. Edmund Voss was not a simple man to read. She had enough clarity about that to keep herself from drawing conclusions she was not yet entitled to draw. He was interested in her. That much was evident, she thought, from the fact that he kept coming back to a house he had no particular social reason to visit, and kept asking questions he did not have to ask. But interest was not a commitment, and a man of his position and his world would have many considerations that Clara, sitting in a drawing room with cold tea, could not fully see. She also thought about herself, about what she actually felt, set apart from what would be convenient to feel, or what was expected of her to feel, given the circumstances. She liked him. That was honest, and she was willing to say it to herself in straightforward terms. She liked the way he thought, and the way he listened, and the way he did not manage her. She liked that he pushed back when he disagreed, instead of agreeing to keep the atmosphere pleasant. She liked that he laughed when something was actually funny. She liked that he had appeared at the door on a Friday morning without a card, because it suggested that the careful social machinery was not the only thing driving his visits. But she was also aware that she was Clara Whitmore, in a plain house, with a complicated family, and a plain history, and that whatever Edmund Voss's reasons for coming to her drawing room, the world he lived in was not a world that moved without friction or consequence. She was not so naive about her situation as to think that any of this was simple. She was not frightened by that complexity, but she was clear-eyed about it, which was, she thought, the more useful response. That Saturday, her mother sat down with her in the small sitting room upstairs, just the two of them, which happened rarely enough that Clara noticed it immediately. Frances had brought her sewing, which she did when she needed something to do with her hands while she thought. She sat in the chair by the window and made several small, careful stitches before she spoke. "He is a man of considerable seriousness," Francis said, in a tone that was feeling its way carefully. "Yes," Clara said. "I spoke with Lady Alder on Thursday at the afternoon gathering. She knows his family, has for years." Clara waited. "She said he is not given to social games," Francis continued, making another stitch. "That he does not make appearances without reason, and does not make visits without intention." Clara thought about this. "What did you say to her?" "I said very little. I listened." That, Clara knew, was genuinely true. Her mother's greatest social skill was the art of listening, in a way that gave away nothing, while gathering everything. "She seemed surprised that he had visited here," Francis said. "Were you surprised?" Clara asked. Francis set her sewing down on her knee and looked at her younger daughter with an expression that Clara did not see often, something open, and a little uncertain, the expression she wore when her calculations had not produced the answer she expected. "Yes," her mother said, simply, with no decoration around it. "I was surprised." Clara nodded. She appreciated the honesty of it. "Clara," her mother said, and then stopped. She picked up her sewing again, and made 2 more stitches, and then set it back down. "I have not always handled you fairly." The room was very quiet. Outside, the garden was gray and still. Clara could hear the fire in the grate, and the faint sound of wind at the window glass. She thought about many things in the space of that quiet. She thought about the gray dress. She thought about the years of being placed at the far end of tables, and told to stay out of sight at gatherings, and given what remained after Eleanor had what she needed. She thought about the books that had been her education, because no one thought her education mattered enough to invest in it otherwise. She thought about the corridor, and how she had ended up there by design, not by accident, left behind, while the rest of the family went through the gilded doors. She also thought about what she had grown into in those years of being overlooked, about the person she had become in the space between being seen and not being seen. She thought about sitting at the kitchen table in the early mornings with Agnes, and reading by the window in the library until the light failed, and the conversations she had had with herself in the quiet of her room when there was no one else to have them with. She thought about standing in the corridor last Saturday and speaking honestly to a man who listened, and not being frightened, and not pretending, and not performing. She could not have done that if she had spent her life being managed and shaped and polished into a version of something expected. She might, in some parallel and kinder history, have been given more, had more support, been seen more clearly by her family. She did not know what version of herself would have emerged from that history. She only knew the version that had emerged from this one. "I know," Clara said to her mother. Francis looked at her carefully. "I am not saying it to excuse it," Francis said. "I know that too," Clara said. Her mother picked up the sewing again. Her fingers moved over the fabric with the automatic skill of someone who had been doing this for 30 years. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. "I would like to do better from here." Clara felt something shift in her chest, not dramatically, not with the rush of feeling that people sometimes describe in stories. Quietly, like a piece of furniture being moved a few inches, just enough to change how the room feels. "All right," she said. And that was all. It was enough. The following week brought a change in the house that Clara noticed without anyone announcing it. Small things, easy to overlook if you were not the kind of person who noticed small things, which Clara had always been. There was a new candle in her room, a good one, the kind that burned cleanly and lasted. The library was dusted properly for the first time in 2 seasons, and someone had reorganized the shelves in a way that put the philosophy section within easy reach. At supper, her mother asked her opinion on the menu for the following week, a task that had previously been given entirely to Eleanor, as if Clara's preferences were not worth factoring in. Eleanor noticed these changes too. Clara could see it. And to her sister's considerable credit, Eleanor said nothing about it except once, privately, when they passed each other on the landing one evening, and Eleanor paused and said, in a very level voice, "She is trying." "I know," Clara said. "I think she feels guilty," Eleanor added, which was an observation that cost Eleanor something to make, because it meant acknowledging that the preferential treatment she had always received was itself a kind of wrong. "I think so too," Clara said. Eleanor nodded once, as if this settled something between them, and went down the stairs. Edmund came on Tuesday of that week, and on Thursday, and on Saturday he came and stayed for 3 hours, and at the end of the visit he asked Clara if she would walk with him the following morning, if the weather held and if she were agreeable. She said she was agreeable. The weather held. They walked in the park near the edge of the village, a wide flat space with old trees and a path that ran alongside a small river. Edmund walked at the pace she walked, not ahead of her, not pulling her along, just beside her, and they talked, as they always talked, about things that interested them. He told her something that morning that she had not expected. He told her, in the straightforward way he had of saying difficult things, that he had been to many gatherings in the past 2 years, and had spoken to many young women, and had found most of those conversations useful in the practical sense, and empty in every other sense. He told her that he had come to dread them slightly, the way you dread something that is necessary but not nourishing. He told her that when he had stepped into the corridor at the Whitmore Gala and found her reading, his first thought had been simply relief. That here, at last, was someone doing something real. Clara listened to this walking beside him on the river path, and she thought about how to respond to it honestly, because she did not want to give him something false, not even something falsely modest, and she did not want to perform a reaction that was not her actual reaction. Her actual reaction was that she was moved by it, genuinely, in the way that being understood by someone moves you when you have been not understood for a long time, not swept off her feet, not undone, simply moved. She told him that. She said, in plain words, that it had been a long time since someone had listened to her the way he listened, and that she was grateful for it, and that she was not trying to make that sound more than it was, only accurate. He looked at her when she said it, and his expression had something in it that she could not quite name, something that was more serious than warmth, and more tender than seriousness. "It is more than accurate," he said. They walked on. The river moved beside them, silver and quick in the morning light. The old trees held their bare arms up against the pale sky. A dog somewhere in the distance was barking at something invisible. Clara thought about the gray dress hanging in the back of the wardrobe upstairs, and the cold corridor, and the cup of tea Agnes had set on the side table, and how none of it had felt like the beginning of anything when it was happening, how beginnings almost never feel like beginnings when you are inside them. She kept walking, with Edmund Voss beside her, on the river path, in the sharp November air. Whatever was coming, she was not afraid of it. She was ready. The village of Harwick was the kind of place where information moved faster than carriages. By Monday of the following week, the news that Edmund Voss, the Duke of Ashford, had walked in the park on Saturday morning with Clara Whitmore, had reached, at minimum, 8 households, 2 of which contained women who had been at the Grand Harvest Gala, and who were still, quietly and with great discipline, processing the idea that the evening had not gone the way they had expected. Clara became aware of this, not because anyone told her directly, which they would not, but because of the quality of the silence she encountered when she went into the village on Monday afternoon to return a book she had borrowed from the small lending library near the church. The woman behind the counter, a thin-faced person named Mrs. Garrett, who had known Clara since she was a child, looked up when she came in, and seemed to be constructing her expression very carefully before she finished assembling it into a smile. "Miss Clara," she said, with a warmth that was roughly 2 degrees warmer than their usual interactions. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Garrett," Clara said, and handed over the book. Mrs. Garrett took it, and turned it over, and read the spine. "Philosophy again," she observed, with the tone of someone making a remark they hope will open a door. "Always," Clara said pleasantly. She selected her next book, paid her small fee, and left, and she could feel Mrs. Garrett's gaze following her all the way out the door, with the same quality that sunflowers follow light, helpless and committed. She had known this would happen. She was a practical person, and she understood how small places operated, how the movement of a man like Edmund Voss through a community left a trail of attention the way a stone leaves a trail of ripples on still water. She had prepared herself for it in the way she prepared herself for most difficult things, by thinking through it clearly in advance, so that when it arrived, she had already made her peace with it. What she had not quite prepared for was the way it would feel to be seen. Not admired, not envied, not watched with calculation, though all of those things were present in the looks she received. Simply seen. For most of Clara's life, she had moved through her community as the other Miss Whitmore, the quiet one, the one who read too much, the one who was, as Mrs. Garrett had once said to someone who did not know Clara was nearby, a shame about the looks, because she was a clever girl. Clara had overheard this, and had thought, with the philosophical detachment she was already developing at 15, that it said more about Mrs. Garrett's priorities than about her own value. But now people looked at her differently, not with understanding, not with any real sense of who she was, but with the particular attention that is given to someone who has been chosen by someone important. The attention said nothing about her, not truly. It said something about him, but it had the effect of making her suddenly visible in a way she had not been before, and that visibility, however hollow its source, had a texture she was not entirely sure what to do with. She thought about it on the walk home. She thought about whether she wanted the visibility, whether it was something she had been wanting without knowing it, whether the years of being overlooked had left in her a hunger to be seen that this new attention was feeding. She tested this idea honestly, and found that it was not quite right. She did not want to be seen, because a duke had walked with her in a park. She had not wanted, at any point in her life, to be the kind of woman whose visibility depended on the man beside her. What she wanted, she realized, was something different, something more internal. She wanted to be seen for what she was, for the contents of herself, the thinking, and the reading, and the honest engagement with ideas that she had been building in private for years. She wanted that to be the thing people noticed, not the person walking next to her. And the fact was that Edmund, on the river path on Saturday, had seen that. He had been speaking to that. He had said that finding her reading in the corridor had been a relief, not because she was Clara Whitmore, or because she was anyone's sister or anyone's daughter, but because she had been doing something real. That was a different kind of being seen, and that she wanted, yes, that she had been wanting for a long time. She came home to find an unexpected visitor in the drawing room. Her mother came to meet her in the hall before she had a chance to remove her coat, which was itself unusual, and her expression had the controlled tension of someone managing a situation. "Lady Alder is here," Frances said, in a low voice. Clara absorbed this. Lady Alder was the woman her mother had mentioned, the one who had known Edmund's family for years. She was, by reputation, one of the more influential figures in the social world they moved around the edges of. A woman of considerable intelligence and considerable opinion who did not make calls without purpose. "Has she asked for me?" Clara said. "She has made a general call," Frances said carefully, "but I think she has come for you." Clara took off her coat and handed it to Mrs. Doyle and went through to the drawing room. Lady Alder was a woman of perhaps 60, compact and upright, with the kind of face that had been striking in its youth, and had settled into something more interesting with age. She had gray eyes that were extraordinarily alert, and a manner that was perfectly pleasant and entirely direct. She was sitting in the chair by the fire when Clara came in, and she looked up and assessed Clara in the approximately 2 seconds it took Clara to cross the room, in the way that some people can assess in 2 seconds what others cannot determine in 2 hours. "Miss Whitmore," she said, "sit down." Clara sat down. Her mother sat at a careful distance, which Clara recognized as her attempt to be present without interfering. "I shall be plain with you," Lady Alder said, "because I have found in my experience that women who read Thornton's essays on justice are generally sensible enough to prefer plainness to maneuvering." Clara felt something that was very close to amusement. "You know his work?" she said. "I read it when it was first published," Lady Alder said. "I disagreed with the third argument." "So did I," Clara said. Lady Alder's eyes narrowed slightly, not with hostility, but with the recalibration of someone updating an impression. "Then we should compare notes later," she said. "But that is not why I have come." "No," Clara agreed. "Edmund Voss is not a man who does things lightly," Lady Alder said. "I have known him since he was a boy. He is serious and careful, and has not, in the years since he came into his title, given anyone reason to think he was ready to enter into any arrangement of the permanent kind. He has had every opportunity. He has not taken them." She paused. "He came to call on you twice in 1 week and walked with you in the park." "Yes," Clara said. "That is not light behavior, for him." Clara held this. "I understand," she said carefully. I do not say this to excite you, Lady Alder said, with the directness of someone who had watched young women be excited to their detriment. I say it because what follows from serious behavior by a serious man is serious consequence, and I think you deserve to have someone say that to you clearly, so that you can decide how you would like to proceed. Frances made a very small sound from her chair, which might have been the sound of a woman who was being given the conversation she did not know how to have herself, but was relieved someone was having. Clara looked at Lady Alder steadily. "What would you advise?" she said, "if you were advising." Lady Alder regarded her with something that was moving toward approval. "I would advise you to continue being exactly what you have evidently been," she said. "He is not here for a performance. He can see performances every day of his life. He has clearly found something he considers genuine, and if my assessment of his character is correct, and I believe it is, he will not be confused on that point. So I would advise you not to alter yourself to fit the situation, because you would be altering the thing that created the situation in the first place." Clara sat with this for a moment. "That is sensible advice," she said. "Most of my advice is sensible," Lady Alder said, without particular pride, simply as a statement of fact. "The difficulty is that not many people take it." She looked at Clara with those alert gray eyes, and Clara looked back, and there was a moment of mutual recognition between them, the kind that happens between certain kinds of people when they meet, where something is understood without needing to be said. "I would also advise," Lady Alder added, "that you take care of that sister of yours. Whatever is happening here is not easy for her. She has been prepared for something that has gone a different direction, and that requires its own kind of adjustment." Clara felt a warmth toward this woman that surprised her a little by its speed. "I am aware," she said quietly. "Good." Lady Alder set down her teacup and prepared to stand. "Then you are more than sensible." She made her visit correctly brief, and left with the particular grace of someone who knows they have accomplished what they came to do. Frances walked her to the door, and Clara heard their voices in the hall, low and careful, her mother's more cautious than usual, Lady Alder's unhurried and clear. Clara sat alone in the drawing room for a little while after. The fire had settled into steady red coals. The afternoon light was going. She thought about what Lady Alder had said, not the parts about Edmund, though those would need their own thought. She thought about the part about Eleanor. Clara knew, with the accuracy of someone who had spent a lifetime watching her family carefully, that Eleanor was holding herself together through this period by means of considerable internal effort. Eleanor was gracious in public and composed in the house, but Clara had seen her sister's face in unguarded moments. In the early morning, before the day had required its full performance. In the kitchen once, when she had thought she was alone, and she had seen something there that was honest and bruised, and was carrying a weight that Eleanor had been trained since childhood to carry without showing. Eleanor had been prepared to be chosen. She had been told, in the many hundreds of small ways that constitute a childhood, that she was the one, that her beauty and her grace and her careful training were the family's greatest assets, that when the moment came, she would be the one standing in the right position to receive it. She had not asked for this. She had not designed this particular architecture. She had simply grown up inside it and become the person it had shaped her into, and now the moment had come, and she was not in it, and that was its own grief. Clara went looking for her sister. She found Eleanor in the upstairs sitting room, sitting at the small writing desk by the window, though she was not writing. She was looking out at the garden, with her hands flat on the desk surface, the way people sit when they are trying to be somewhere other than where they are. Clara sat down across the room without speaking. Eleanor did not turn from the window. The light outside was going gray and cold. "Lady Alder came," Clara said. "I heard," Eleanor said. "She said something about you, about how this has been for you." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "She is perceptive," she said finally. "She is." Eleanor turned from the window. Her face was the composed, careful face she wore in company. But beneath it, there was the tiredness Clara had noticed before, and something else now that was gentler than she expected. Something that was very close to acceptance, though it had clearly cost her to arrive at it. "I do not blame you," Eleanor said. "I want you to know that. Not as something I am forcing myself to say. I mean it." "I know," Clara said. "I think," Eleanor continued slowly, as if she were choosing each word from a collection and examining it before placing it. that I have spent so many years believing a particular story about my life, that I did not think about whether I actually wanted what was in the story. I only knew I was supposed to want it. She paused. That is a strange thing to realize. It is a very honest thing to realize, Clara said. Eleanor looked at her with eyes that were slightly brighter than usual. He is a good person? She asked. You think so genuinely? I think so genuinely, Clara said. He is serious, and he is honest, and he listens. Eleanor absorbed this. Then I am glad, she said. I am working toward being glad. I am almost there. Clara left the space between them open, not trying to fill it with comfort or reassurance, because Eleanor did not need those things, and they both knew it. She only sat in the chair across the room while the light outside went darker and the fire burned down, and her sister looked out the window at the fading garden and did the slow and quiet work of letting one version of the future go and beginning to look at what was actually there. It was not a dramatic moment. It was not the kind of moment that makes a good story, but Clara thought it was more important than most dramatic moments because it was real, and it required something actual from both of them, and they came through it intact. Which was, in the end, the only way through. Edmund came to the house on the following Wednesday, with his hat in his hands, and a directness in his face that Clara recognized immediately as the expression of someone who has decided to say something and has decided not to bury it in ceremony. She was alone in the drawing room when he arrived, because her mother had arranged this, quietly and without discussion, by simply happening to be in another part of the house when Mrs. Doyle announced him, and saying that she would be along presently, which they all understood to mean she would not. He sat across from her and did not take the tea that Mrs. Doyle offered, and looked at Clara with that calm, direct gaze of his, and said, I want to speak plainly to you about something, if you are willing. I am always willing for plainness, Clara said. I know, he said. That is partly what I want to speak about. He was quiet for a moment, not from hesitation, Clara thought, but from the habit of choosing words carefully. He was a careful man. He was precise about language, in the same way that he was precise about ideas, not because he mistrusted himself, but because he respected whoever he was speaking to enough to get it right. I have been in this situation before, he said, or what appeared to be the same situation. I have met young women who were presented to me as possibilities, and who were charming and accomplished, and who said the right things very well. He paused. I was never interested. Not once? Clara asked. Not once, he said. I want you to know that. I have thought about it a great deal. I was not indifferent because I lacked feeling. I was indifferent because I could not find anyone I could speak to. Clara looked at him. Truly speak to, she said, not as a question. Yes. The way people speak when they are not performing their speaking. She understood this completely, so she said simply, yes. In the corridor, he said, you told me exactly what you thought about an argument you found inadequate. You did not look at me to check whether I wanted to hear it. You did not soften it or redirect it. You said what you thought, and you meant it. It would have been dishonest not to, Clara said. I know, he said, and that is exactly it. He looked at her for a moment with something serious and whole in his expression, and then he said, I am not given to rushing things. I do not make decisions before I have thought them through, and I do not say things I am not prepared to stand behind. But I think you should know, and I think you deserve to know, that my visits here are not casual for me, that what I am doing, in coming here, in asking to walk with you, in finding every reason I can manage to be in the same room as you, is not something I do without meaning. She did not rush to fill the silence. She took what he had said and held it with the care it deserved. I appreciate your honesty, she said at last. I hope for more than your appreciation, he said, with a quietness that made it clear he was not being flippant. I know, Clara said. What I mean is that I appreciate it in the sense that I recognize what it costs to say something like that plainly, and that I want to be equally plain in return. He was watching her with full attention. I have been overlooked for most of my life, Clara said. Not through malice mostly, through calculation, through my family's very reasonable conclusion that I was not the one who would serve their needs best. I have spent a great deal of time in corridors and kitchens and library chairs, while the more important events happened somewhere else. She paused. What I am trying to say is that I know the difference between being noticed because someone finds you convenient and being noticed Because someone genuinely sees you. I have had almost nothing of the second kind, and I will not pretend not to feel the difference. You should not pretend, he said. I am not, she said. I am telling you that I feel it. That your visits mean something to me, because they appear to come from the second kind of noticing, not the first. And that I am still careful, because I am always careful, and because I have learned to be, but that I am not indifferent. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then he said, That is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in a social context, in as long as I can remember. I thought you might be tired of dishonesty, Clara said. I am exhausted by it, he said simply. There was a beat of silence that was not uncomfortable. Outside, the November wind moved through the garden, and they could hear it at the window, a low and steady sound. May I ask you something? Clara said. Anything. What was the first thing you thought? When you saw me in the corridor, the very first thing, before you made any decision about whether to speak. He thought about this honestly, which she appreciated. He did not give her the pretty answer immediately. He considered it. I thought, he said, that you looked as if you were somewhere else entirely, as if the party behind the doors had nothing to do with you, and I wondered what was more interesting to you than whatever was in that ballroom. A philosophy essay, she said. Yes, and then I was curious about a person who found a philosophy essay more interesting than a ballroom full of possibilities, and I thought I would find out. Clara looked at him. And have you? Found out? I am finding out, he said. I think it will take considerably longer than a few weeks. Do you mind that? She asked. No, he said. I have waited a long time for interesting. I can wait a little longer. She smiled then, not the careful social smile that she had learned to produce on request, but the real one, the one that changed her whole face. He looked at that smile with a particular stillness, as if it were something he was committing to memory. Neither of them said anything for a moment. They did not need to. His next visit was the following Saturday, and he brought something with him that he carried under his arm, in a way that suggested he had thought about whether to bring it, and had decided to in the end. It was a book. He handed it to Clara when he sat down, across the drawing-room table, and said, I read this last night, and I disagreed with the main argument in the second chapter. And I thought you would also disagree, but possibly for different reasons, and I wanted to find out which ones. Clara took the book and turned it over, and read the first page of the second chapter while he waited, and then she looked up and said, I already disagree with the premise. Tell me, he said, and leaned forward slightly in his chair. They spent 2 hours on it, not agreeing, not performing agreement, actually working through the argument, together, with the kind of rigor that makes thinking sharper instead of duller. The kind that is, Clara had long since concluded, one of the rarest things in the world. Her mother appeared at the doorway near the end of the second hour, looked at the two of them, at the book open on the table between them and the scattered notes Clara had made on a small pad, and Edmund's coat over the back of the chair, because he had taken it off to be more comfortable, and Francis's face did something that was not entirely readable, but that contained, Clara thought, the first genuine warmth she had directed at this situation. Will you stay for supper? Francis asked Edmund. He looked at Clara. Clara looked back. This was, they both understood, a different kind of question from the casual lunch invitation of the previous week. Supper was the household. Supper meant a chair at the table, the family's evening, all of them together. If it is not an inconvenience, Edmund said. It is not, Clara said. And so Edmund Voss sat down for supper at the Whitmore table for the first time, in the modest dining room, with its slightly uneven legs on the table, and its good candlesticks, that had come down from Clara's grandmother, and its window that looked out on the garden, where nothing was growing now, because it was November, and the ground was hard. Eleanor was there. She had known he was coming, or had guessed it, because she came to supper with her composure entirely in order, and managed the evening with the kind of gracious ease that was her real gift, making conversation lightly and intelligently, drawing Edmund in without directing too much at him, creating the kind of table atmosphere that is comfortable without requiring effort. Edmund, Clara noticed, watched Eleanor with the respectful attention you give to someone you recognize as performing a difficult act with skill. He was not indifferent to what it cost her. Clara had suspected he would not be. He was perceptive in the way that serious people are perceptive, not only about ideas, but about people, about what is happening beneath the surface of things. After supper, while Eleanor helped their mother carry things to the sideboard, Edmund came to stand beside Clara near the window and said, very quietly, "Your sister is exceptional." "I know," Clara said. "This is not easy for her." "No." He was quiet for a moment. "She is handling it with more grace than most people would manage." "She is," Clara agreed. "She is better than people have given her credit for, in ways they have not thought to look for." Edmund looked at her. "Like you," he said. Clara turned to look back out at the dark garden. "We are different kinds of better," she said. "Yes," he agreed, "but the same failure of looking." She thought about that for a moment. She thought about her mother's calculation, years ago, that Eleanor was the asset, and Clara was the remainder. She thought about the gray dress. She thought about Lady Alder's visit and her sister's face at the window. "Do you know what I think?" she said quietly. "Tell me. I think that when you overlook someone long enough, you train them to exist without you, and then when you look, you are surprised to find they have built something you never expected, because you were not watching." Edmund was silent for a moment. Then he said, "That is a more generous interpretation of neglect than I would have offered." "I am not being generous," she said. "I am being accurate." He looked at her with that expression she was coming to know, the one that was more serious than warmth, and more tender than seriousness. The one that said, without any words at all, that he was exactly where he had chosen to be. "You are both," he said. "Always both." Eleanor came back into the room, and their mother came with her, and the evening moved on into its later and quieter stages. The fire lower, the candles burning into themselves, the conversation gentler, and more tired, as evenings become, when they are good ones. Clara sat in the drawing room with her family, and with Edmund Voss, and she thought about corridors, and gray dresses, and philosophy books, and the particular way the world looks when someone is finally, genuinely looking at you, and she thought it was possible, quietly and carefully, and without rushing, to let herself believe that the world she had built in private, the one she had assembled from books and thoughts and years of careful watching, was not smaller than the world on the other side of the ballroom doors. It was different, it was hers, and it was, it turned out, exactly enough. The letter came from Edmund's household on a Monday morning, addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, except that there was no Mr. Whitmore, and so it was addressed to Francis Whitmore, and it was written in the formal language that letters of intention use when they are doing something precise and permanent. Francis read it once at the breakfast table and then set it down very carefully, as if it were something that might break. Clara was not at the table when it arrived. She was in the garden in her coat, in the sharp December morning, walking the perimeter of the grounds the way she sometimes did, when her thoughts needed room to move. She had been thinking about something Edmund had said during supper the previous Thursday, a remark about the nature of obligation, and whether it was always distinct from desire, which had been part of a larger conversation, but which had stayed with her. She came inside through the kitchen door, stamping her boots on the mat, and Agnes looked up from the stove with an expression that contained a great deal. "Something has happened," Clara said. It was not a question. "Your mother is in the breakfast room," Agnes said. Clara went through. Frances was still sitting at the table with the letter in front of her, and a cup of tea she was not drinking. She looked up when Clara came in, and her expression was the most complicated thing Clara had ever seen on that face, which was saying something, because Frances Whitmore's face had contained many complicated things over the years. "Sit down," her mother said. Clara sat. Frances pushed the letter across the table. Clara picked it up and read it. It was a formal letter of interest. Edmund had written to her family to express his intention to pursue a formal courtship with the aim, should all parties be willing, and should the understanding between himself and Miss Clara Whitmore continue to develop as he hoped, of a permanent arrangement. He had written it himself, not through a solicitor or an agent, which Clara noticed and thought was characteristic of him. He was a man who did his own important things. She read it to the end and set it down. "Well," she said. "Yes," her mother said. They looked at each other across the breakfast table. Outside the window the garden was gray and cold and still. The fire in the grate was burning well. The house was quiet. Eleanor still asleep, or at least still upstairs. the servants moving softly through their early routines. "How do you feel?" her mother asked. It was a simple question, and Clara recognized, in the asking of it, something her mother had not always thought to ask. The older Francis, the one from before the gala, before the calling card, before the slow and difficult rearrangement that had been happening in this household, would not have asked. She would have told. She would have discussed what was appropriate and what was required and what the family's position necessitated, and Clara's feelings would have been a factor in the equation, but not the first one. "I am thinking," Clara said honestly. Her mother nodded, as if this was the correct answer. Clara looked at the letter again. She thought about Edmund. She thought about his seriousness and his directness, and the way he listened, and the way he challenged her thinking, and the way he had appeared at the door without a card, because he could not wait for the formalities. She thought about the supper in this room, and the walk by the river, and the corridor at the gala where everything had started, the amber light, and the cold tea, and the philosophy essay. She thought about what marriage meant, not in the abstract but in the specific. She was practical enough, and she had read enough, to know that a permanent arrangement between two people was not a continuation of pleasant conversations in drawing rooms. It was a life, shared fully, in all its dimensions, the practical and the difficult, and the mundane, alongside the interesting. It required not just that you enjoyed someone's company, but that you trusted them, that you believed in their character as a thing that would hold when things were not easy. She had been watching Edmund's character since the first evening. She had been watching it the way she watched everything, carefully, and without letting sentiment tell her what to see. She had watched him be honest when a polished answer would have been easier. She had watched him be respectful to Eleanor, in a situation that required sensitivity, and had not required his sensitivity in any practical way. She had watched him defer to her thinking, rather than to her need to agree with his. She had watched him sit at a modest supper table, without any trace of condescension or performance. She trusted his character. She was clear about that. What she was less clear about was what she wanted, not what was available, not what was possible, not what would be good for the family, or appropriate given the circumstances, or the wisest decision given her position. What she, Clara Whitmore, actually wanted. She sat at the breakfast table with her mother, and the fire burning, and December pressing against the windows, and she asked herself that question, the way she asked all serious questions, honestly, and without looking away from the answer. She wanted the conversations. She wanted the particular quality of being in a room with someone who was genuinely thinking alongside you and would not stop doing so. She wanted the morning walks and the books across the table, and the way he said, "Tell me," and actually waited to hear. She also wanted the rest of it, she admitted to herself, the life, the fullness of a permanent thing, the kind of companionship that is built over years rather than weeks. She wanted that, with someone whose character she trusted, and whose mind she found endlessly interesting, and she could not think of another person in her life who fit both. "I would like to speak with him," she told her mother, "before anything is decided formally. I would like to speak with him myself." Francis looked at her. "That is not traditionally how this is arranged." "I know," Clara said, "but it is how I need it to be arranged." Her mother held her gaze for a long moment. Then she said, "I will send a note." Edmund came the next afternoon. He came without his coat this time, or rather he left it in the hall, which was not the normal thing to do, and which Clara thought was characteristic of him, the way he shed formality, when formality was not serving anything. He came into the drawing room, and they sat down, and Clara looked at him directly and said, "I received your letter." "I know," he said. "I wrote it." "I need to ask you something," she said, directly. "Yes," he said. "When you wrote it," she said, "were you writing it because your position requires you to formalize arrangements of this kind in a particular way, or were you writing it because you wanted to?" He did not answer immediately, which she respected. He thought about it. "Both," he said, "but the desire came before the requirement. I wanted to formalize something that I had already decided was real to me. The form of the letter was required. The intention behind it was mine." "What is your intention?" she asked. He looked at her with complete steadiness. "To spend a great deal more time with you," he said, "over a much longer period than a social season. To have the kind of conversations we have been having indefinitely. To have the company of someone who thinks in a way that makes my own thinking better. He paused. And all the other things that come with a permanent arrangement, which I want with you, and have not wanted with anyone else. Clara held this carefully. I am not a simple proposition, she said. I do not mean that proudly. I mean it as information. I have opinions that are not conventional. I read things that make most people in our circle uncomfortable. I will not change those things. I know, he said. I have not once wanted you to. My family situation is not straightforward, she continued. My mother is a complicated woman who has made decisions I do not entirely endorse. My sister has been placed in a difficult position by this, and I will not abandon her to manage it alone. I would not expect you to, he said. And I am not good at pretending, she said. If something is wrong, I will say so. If I disagree, I will say that too. I cannot promise to be easy. He looked at her with something in his face that was close to joy, though too quiet and serious to quite be called that. Clara, he said gently, I have been trying to find someone worth disagreeing with for a very long time. She felt something in her chest that was warm and solid and real. All right, she said. All right, he repeated. All right, she said again. I am saying yes to the thing you wrote in the letter, or beginning to. I think there should be time still, proper time. Not because I am uncertain of you, but because I am a careful person, and I want to do things in the right order. So do I, he said. That is exactly what I proposed. She smiled. I know. I read it twice. He smiled back, and it was the real version, the one that reached his eyes and changed his face. Then we are in agreement, he said. On this point, yes, she said. I reserve the right to disagree on all subsequent points. I would be disappointed if you did not, he said. Mrs. Doyle appeared at the door at some point after this, with tea that had not been requested, but which appeared to have been prepared in anticipation, and she set it down with the quietly satisfied expression of someone who has been watching a situation develop for some weeks, and is pleased with its direction. Clara poured the tea. Edmund took the cup she offered him. Outside, the December afternoon was going dark early, the way December does, the light leaving before it felt it had properly arrived. They sat together in the drawing room, with the fire and the tea and the first real piece of an arrangement that had been building since a corridor and a philosophy essay and a woman who did not look up from her reading until she had finished the sentence. Later, when Frances came in and was told quietly by Clara that a response to the letter would be forthcoming in the affirmative, she sat down in the armchair by the fire, with the controlled expression of someone absorbing something very large, and after a moment she said, I owe you an apology. Clara looked at her. For which part? She asked, without malice. Frances looked into the fire. The gray dress, she said. Mostly. But also everything the gray dress meant. Clara was quiet for a moment. I know, she said, for the last time, and she meant it differently this time, not as acknowledgement or as patience, as acceptance, the kind that is not resignation, but resolution, the kind you arrive at when you understand something fully enough to set it down. Frances nodded. She pressed her lips together once, and then smoothed her hands on her skirt and squared her shoulders, because she was Frances Whitmore, and she squared her shoulders the way other people breathed, automatically and always. Then, we will move forward, she said. Yes, Clara said, we will. Edmund stayed until the last of the light was gone, and when he left he said goodnight to Clara's mother, and to Eleanor, who had come downstairs by then, and who managed the moment with the grace that was her real and extraordinary gift. And then he said goodnight to Clara last, and his expression when he looked at her was the most unguarded thing she had yet seen on his face, and she filed it away in the careful archive of her memory, where she kept things that mattered. The front door closed, the house settled. Agnes appeared from the kitchen with a pot of soup and the expression of someone who had been waiting to find out how things turned out. Clara sat down at the kitchen table and told her. Agnes listened with great attention and made several sounds of approval, and said finally, well, it took long enough, which was not entirely accurate, given the timeline, but which Clara understood was Agnes's way of saying she was pleased. She was pleased herself. Not wildly, not overwhelmingly, in the way of a person who has hoped carefully and arrived at something worth the hoping, It was, she thought, exactly the right amount. The news reached wider circles, the way all news does in a small world, not through any announcement, but through the particular movement of knowing that travels between people who have been watching. Lady Alder, who had apparently been watching more closely than anyone understood, sent a note the day after Edmund's visit that was brief and warm and contained, at the end, a single line that read, "I told you to continue being yourself. I am glad you listened." Clara kept the note. The Whitmore family's social calendar, which had always been respectable but never particularly sought after, changed in the weeks that followed, in ways that were both significant and slightly absurd. Invitations arrived that had not arrived before. People who had previously managed to look through Clara at gatherings now looked directly at her and held the gaze with great warmth. A woman who had described her, within earshot, as the plain Whitmore, 2 years prior, called at the house and spent 40 minutes in the drawing room, being extremely pleasant and leaving, without quite achieving, whatever she had come for. Clara watched all of this with the same careful attention she watched everything, and she found it mostly interesting as a social phenomenon and mostly irrelevant as a personal one. She had not been overlooked for years, and then noticed because of Edmund's interest, in order to feel validated by that noticing. The validation she cared about had come from the corridor, from a conversation in amber light, from a man who had asked about a book and listened to the answer. Everything else was noise, though not uninteresting noise. Edmund, for his part, was consistent. He came when he said he would come, and said what he meant, and did not change his manner, based on the changing social temperature around the Whitmore household. He was the same man in the drawing room as he had been in the corridor, which was not a small thing, Clara thought. People are often different once the stakes become clear. They become either more careful or less careful, either performing or retreating. Edmund simply continued. He brought her things she had not asked for, but that he had thought she would want. A pamphlet by a writer she had mentioned once in passing. A letter he had received from a colleague on a scientific matter they had discussed. A small annotated edition of a text she had referenced, with the previous owner's notes still in the margins, because he thought she would find the notes interesting, rather than intrusive. She did. She found them fascinating. She spent an afternoon following one particularly argumentative margin writer through their disagreements with the author, and then told Edmund about it the next day in detail, and he listened the way he always listened, with his full attention and the occasional well-timed interruption. Frances Whitmore handled the new attention her household was receiving, with the practiced skill of someone who had been managing social situations for decades, and who was also, Clara could see, doing her best to do so in a way that did not put Clara's comfort below the family's advantage. This was a newer version of her mother, one Clara was still learning to trust, but was finding increasingly real. Frances did not, for instance, agree to every social engagement that arrived suddenly. She declined a dinner invitation from a family who had previously declined to invite the Whitmore women at all, and whose motives were transparently opportunistic. She was polite in declining, and clear in her reason, without stating it directly, which was itself a kind of statement. She told Clara about this afterward, not to receive praise but because she thought Clara should know. "You did not need to tell me," Clara said. "I wanted to," her mother said. "I am trying to be a different kind of careful from now on." Eleanor was navigating her own adjustment with the thoroughness she brought to everything. She was not performing contentment, which would have been easy for her, and which Clara would have seen through immediately. She was actually working through something, and Clara could see the process of it from day to day, the slow and serious work of reorienting yourself when the direction you expected has changed. What she was orienting toward, Clara was not yet sure. But she noticed that Eleanor had begun to take walks on her own in the mornings, which was new, and that she had started reading more, also new. Borrowing books from the library rather than waiting for them to be placed in her path. She had written several letters to a woman she had not seen since school, and had received long replies that she read privately and with visible attention. Clara did not ask about these things. Eleanor would tell her what she wanted to tell her in her own time, and the rest was Eleanor's business. What Clara observed was that her sister seemed, over the weeks of December, to be moving towards something rather than simply away from something. That was, Clara thought, the right direction. One afternoon in mid-December, Eleanor came into the library where Clara was reading, and sat down in the opposite chair and said, without preamble, "I have been thinking about going somewhere." Clara looked up. Somewhere. Away from here, Eleanor said. Not permanently. But for a while. My friend Louisa has written to say I am welcome to visit, and she is in the north, and I think perhaps being in a different place for a few months might be good for me. Clara thought about this. When? She said. In the new year, perhaps, after the formal arrangements here are settled. You do not need to wait for that, Clara said. Eleanor looked at her. I want to be here for what is coming, she said. I am not going, because I cannot bear to be here. I am going because I want to, and there is a difference. There is, Clara agreed. They were quiet for a moment, two women in a library that had been mostly Clara's domain for years, sitting in the afternoon light that came in pale and thin through the December windows. Will you be all right? Eleanor said. It was a small question, the kind that is not really small at all. I think so, Clara said. More than I expected, probably. Eleanor nodded. She looked at the shelves of books around her, with the expression of someone who is noticing something they have not looked at directly before. You built something in here, she said quietly. All those years, I did not see it, but you did. So did you, Clara said. Just differently. Eleanor looked back at her. I am not sure what I built, she said. I think I may need to find out. Then go to Louisa's, Clara said, and find out. Eleanor smiled, a small and genuine one, and then she stood and picked up the book she had brought in, an actual book, not a pretext, and she said she would leave Clara to it, and she left, and Clara went back to her reading, and the afternoon was warm and quiet, and full of the particular peace of a house where things are, slowly and imperfectly, being set right. The formal arrangements moved through their stages, with the deliberate pacing of such things. There were meetings between Edmund's solicitor and the family's solicitor, who was an old man named Mr. Fairweather, who had managed the Whitmore family's modest legal affairs for 30 years, and who received the news of what he was now managing, with a careful blankness that Clara suspected concealed considerable surprise. There were letters and responses and the particular administrative machinery that such things require, and Clara was consulted at every stage, not as a formality, but because Edmund had made it clear to everyone involved that her preferences were not peripheral to the process. This was unusual. Clara knew it was unusual. She had enough knowledge of how such arrangements generally operated to understand that the expectation was typically that the woman in her position was informed rather than consulted. Edmund had made no announcement about this. He had simply proceeded as if it were natural to include her, and no one had argued, possibly because no one had felt certain enough to argue with a duke about how he wished to conduct his own affairs. She found that she had opinions about the arrangements. Practical ones, specific ones, opinions about what she needed and what she was not willing to relinquish, and what she hoped for in the life she was going to be building. She expressed these clearly and without apology, and Edmund listened to them with attention and incorporated them into what was being designed. She wanted to continue reading whatever she chose to read. That was not a negotiation. He had laughed when she said it, a genuine laugh, and said that was the least interesting thing she could have stipulated, since it was already assumed. She wanted to maintain a real relationship with her family, even as her circumstances changed substantially. She wanted to be able to have Eleanor and her mother to stay. She wanted to be able to visit them. She did not want the distance that sometimes grew between families when one person's world expanded significantly. Edmund had not only agreed to this, but had suggested, gently and without making it a large thing, that her mother might benefit from some additional support, not charity, which he understood Frances Whitmore would not accept, but some arrangement that reduced the household's financial anxiety in a way that could be framed as practical assistance between connected families. Clara had looked at him when he said this, and had felt, again, the quality of being seen by someone who actually looked. She had also said, once, in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely, that she wanted him to know she was not going to become a different person, because her circumstances changed. She was going to remain the woman from the corridor, the one who finished sentences before she looked up, the one who disagreed with essays and said so, the one who was more comfortable in a kitchen with Agnes than in a ballroom with carefully arranged people. He had said, with that quiet steadiness of his, that he was counting on it. Christmas that year was different from any Christmas Clara could remember. Not because anything dramatic had changed yet. The formal arrangements were not concluded. No announcements had been made publicly. The world was not yet transformed. But the household felt different. It felt like a house where things were possible. It felt like a house where the future was something to move toward rather than something to manage. Edmund came on Christmas morning with gifts for the whole family, practical and thoughtful and perfectly chosen, which Clara thought was itself a kind of statement about who he was. He stayed for the afternoon. He sat in the Whitmore drawing room and talked with Eleanor about her plans to visit Louisa and seemed genuinely interested in them. He talked with Frances about the garden and her plans for the spring, with a courtesy that was not performance, but real attention. He helped Agnes with something in the kitchen, which was the thing Eleanor recounted afterward with the most consistent astonishment, and which made Agnes beam for the rest of the day. He sat beside Clara in the evening, while the fire burned low and the household was warm and slightly tired, with the pleasant tiredness of a good day, and he said very little, which was one of the things she had come to appreciate about him, that he understood silence as a form of companionship rather than an absence. She thought about the gala, about the gray dress and the cold corridor and the cup of tea on the side table. She thought about the moment she had looked up from her book and seen him standing 6 feet away, recalibrating. She thought about how accidental it had all seemed, and how, now, it seemed like the only possible way it could have gone. She thought about what Lady Alder had said. Continue being exactly what you have evidently been. She had been exactly herself, in a corridor, on a night when no one was looking at her, when there was no reason to perform, or to hope, or to angle toward anything. She had simply been there, with her book and her thoughts and her cup of cold tea, existing with the full and quiet dignity of someone who has learned to be her own company. And the right person had walked past everyone to find her. Not because of luck, not entirely. Because when you are genuinely, fully, completely yourself, even in a gray dress in an empty corridor, there is a quality to you that does not require an audience. There is a realness that cannot be faked and does not need to be. And sometimes, the right person walks past every performance in the room, past every carefully arranged presentation, past every strategic positioning, and finds their way to the only real thing there is. Clara looked into the fire on that Christmas evening, in her warm house with the people she loved around her, and a future ahead of her that was better than she had allowed herself to picture, and she felt something settle in her that had been unsteady for a long time. Not gratitude exactly, more than that. Recognition. This was her life. This, all of it, the years in the corridor and the years before them, and everything that was coming. She recognized it, the way you sometimes recognize something true when you finally stop to look at it clearly. It was hers, all of it, and she was ready to live it. January arrived with the kind of cold that is serious about itself. The ground in the Whitmore garden froze solid, the fountain at the center stopped moving and became a gray pillar of ice, and the mornings were so dark that the household candles burned until nearly 10 o'clock. Clara did not mind the cold. She had always been a person who found winter clarifying. Summer, with its long open days and its expectation of social movement, had always felt slightly pressured to her, as if she were supposed to be doing more with so much light. Winter gave her permission to be interior, to sit deep in the house with a fire and a book, and not feel she was missing anything by staying still. She was in the library on the first Tuesday of the new year, when Mrs. Doyle appeared at the door, with an expression that suggested something significant. "Mr. Fairweather is here, miss," she said. Clara set her book down. "My mother's solicitor?" "And another gentleman from his office," Mrs. Doyle said, with the inflection that indicated she thought this was worth noting. Clara went through to the sitting room, where Mr. Fairweather was waiting. He was a short and precise man, with white hair and very careful eyes, who had been dealing with the affairs of the Whitmore family since before Clara was born. He stood when she came in, and greeted her with more formality than he usually used, which told her something before he said anything. The young man from his office stood nearby with papers. "Miss Whitmore," Mr. Fairweather said, "I have been asked to attend to 1 or 2 matters on behalf of His Grace, regarding the formal arrangements as they stand." Mr. Fairweather sat down opposite her and arranged his papers and looked at her over the edge of them with his careful eyes. "His Grace wishes to communicate certain details regarding the arrangements to you directly," he said, "before they are finalized with your family's solicitor. He felt it important that you understand the specifics before anyone else does." Clara folded her hands in her lap and waited. What Mr. Fairweather outlined over the next 30 minutes was not what she had expected, and she had thought about it enough to have a reasonably formed expectation. Edmund had been more thorough than she had anticipated, which she realized she should not have been surprised by, given everything she knew of his character. He had made provisions not only for the arrangement itself, but for several things around it that she had not asked for, and had not thought to ask for. There was provision for her mother's household. Not charity, not assistance, but a structured arrangement that would allow Frances Whitmore to manage her household comfortably, and without the quiet anxiety that had run underneath the family's daily life for as long as Clara could remember. It was framed as a family connection arrangement, which it was, and which meant Frances could accept it without the feeling of having been rescued, which mattered to her, and which Edmund had understood would matter. There was provision for Eleanor specifically, a sum set aside in a way that Eleanor could use as she wished, not tied to any particular outcome, not conditional on any particular event. It was simply Eleanor's, to live on as she determined, which meant Eleanor's future was not contingent on anything except Eleanor. There was the matter of the library. Edmund had spoken with Clara about this, which she remembered now in a new light. He had asked once, during a conversation about books, what she would take with her, if she could take anything from the Whitmore household to start somewhere new. She had said the library, half joking, because that was where she had lived for so many years. He had nodded, and said something about how books move better than furniture, which she had taken as a casual remark. He had, in fact, arranged for the library to come with her. Every book. Mr. Fairweather explained this with the quiet satisfaction of a man delivering something he thinks is well done, which Clara found, in her slightly stunned state, rather touching. She sat with all of this for a moment after Mr. Fairweather finished. "He arranged this before I answered the letter," she said. "He began the arrangements after his second visit to this household," Mr. Fairweather confirmed, "which was the Thursday, which was before the formal letter, which was before she had said yes to anything." "He was that certain?" she said. Mr. Fairweather's precise face did something that was as close to warmth as it got. "In my experience, Miss Whitmore, His Grace is certain about very little. He is the most careful man I know. But on this particular matter, he appeared settled in a way I have not previously observed." Clara sat with that for a moment longer. Then she said, "Is there anything requiring my signature today?" "Not today," Mr. Fairweather said. "Today was about your knowing." "Tell him," Clara said, "that I appreciate it. Not the provisions, the telling." Mr. Fairweather nodded, as if he understood exactly what she meant, which she suspected he did. She saw him out, and returned to the library, and stood inside the door for a moment, looking at the shelves she had spent so many years with, the green chair, the window with the garden beyond it, the particular angle of morning light that came in and made the spines of the older books glow. She had lived inside this room when she had nowhere else to be, and it had given her everything she had needed to become the person she was. It was coming with her. He had thought of that. He had thought of her. She sat down in the green chair and picked up her book and held it for a moment without opening it, and she thought that some things in life are exactly what they appear to be, and that was rare enough to notice. Her mother came to find her later in the afternoon. Frances came into the library with the careful knock she had taken to giving, before entering, another new habit, and sat in the chair across from Clara's without being asked. "Mr. Fairweather came to me this afternoon as well," Frances said. "I expected he would," Clara said. Frances pressed her lips together once. "The arrangement regarding the household," she said. "I want you to know that I understand why it was made the way it was made." "Good," Clara said. "I want you to also know," Frances continued, with the careful determination of someone who has prepared what they want to say, "that I do not accept it because of the money. I accept it because it allows me to accept it, if you understand what I mean." Clara did understand. "It was thoughtfully done," she said. "It was," Frances agreed. "He is a thoughtful man." "Yes." Frances was quiet for a moment, looking at the bookshelves with the expression she had been wearing around the library lately, the slightly wondering look of someone who is reassessing what a room means. "He asked me something," she said. "When he called last Thursday, he asked whether the library had always been your space." "What did you say?" "I said, it had become so," Frances said, "and that it had been good for you, having somewhere to belong." She paused. "I said it the way I meant it, and I think he understood that I meant it honestly." Clara nodded. She thought about her mother saying that. She thought about what it had taken for Frances Whitmore to say something like that, which was not a complicated sentence but which contained inside it an acknowledgement of years of choices that had not fully accounted for Clara. "He listened?" Clara said. "He always listens," Frances said, with the tone of someone who has been both impressed and slightly unsettled by this quality. "I know," Clara said. They sat for a while in the library together, which was unusual in itself. Frances Whitmore did not generally sit in the library. She was a practical woman, and libraries made her slightly uncomfortable. All those ideas sitting around requiring attention. But she sat now in the chair across from her daughter, in the winter afternoon light, and she was quiet, in the way that people are quiet, when they are finally letting themselves feel something they have been carefully managing. Clara did not interrupt this. She understood the value of it. "I have been thinking," Frances said finally, "about what I would have done differently, if I had it to do again." "You do not have to think about that," Clara said. "I know I do not have to," her mother said. "But I am. I have been. And I think the honest answer is that I would have looked at you more carefully, from the beginning." She pressed her hands flat on her knees. "I looked at Eleanor, and I thought I understood what I was seeing, and I put everything behind that understanding. And I looked at you and I thought, I also understood, and I was wrong. I was wrong about both of you, in different ways." Clara thought about Eleanor in the north with Louisa, doing whatever she was doing, finding out what she was building. She thought about her sister on the landing, saying she thought their mother was trying. She thought about the apple tree in the garden and the honest tiredness in Eleanor's face that afternoon. "You were not entirely wrong," Clara said. "You were incomplete. There is a difference." Frances looked at her. "That is kind," she said. "It is accurate," Clara said. "I told Edmund once that accuracy and generosity are not always in opposition. I think this is one of those cases." Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You are going to be fine, Clara." It was a simple thing, the kind of thing that might sound like nothing, but coming from Frances Whitmore, who did not say things casually, it was not nothing. It was a long time arriving, and it was the right time, and Clara received it without ceremony. "I know," she said. And she did. The weeks that followed moved with the particular quality of a period that is in between things, not quite ended, and not quite begun. The formal arrangements were progressing through their stages. Edmund continued his visits, which were the same as they had always been, which was to say they were real. He brought the annotated edition of a new essay. He had a long conversation with Agnes about bread, which Clara overheard from the hall, and which she thought was one of the finer things that had happened in the house in years. He spent one afternoon in the garden with Clara despite the cold, walking the perimeter while the frost crunched under their feet, and they talked about almost everything and almost nothing, and both found it worthwhile. One evening he said to her, on the way out, with his coat on and his hat in his hand, and the cold air coming in through the open front door, "I want you to know something." "Tell me," she said, in the words he always used with her. "I know what I have asked you to leave behind," he said. "The life you built here, the quiet of it, the freedom of it. I know that what I am proposing involves a very different kind of world, and I do not take lightly the fact that it changes things for you that were yours." She looked at him in the light of the hallway. He was serious, the way he was serious when something mattered, not performing earnestness but carrying it. "It does change things," she said. "I am not going to pretend it does not." "I know," he said. "I only want you to also know that I intend to make sure the things that matter to you come with you. Not the furniture, the things that are actually you." She thought about the library. She thought about the conversations. She thought about what he had arranged before she had even answered his letter. "They already are," she said. He nodded, and something in his face settled in the way it settled when things were right. He said good night. She said it back. The door closed. The cold was on the other side of it now, and the house was warm, and Clara stood in the hallway for a moment, in the quiet of it. A new chapter was coming. She could feel the shape of it, not its details, not the specific texture of the life ahead, but its direction, its possibility. She was not afraid of possibility. She had been building toward it for years, in a library, in a corridor, in a gray dress, in a kitchen with cold tea and a borrowed book. She had always been moving toward this, even when she had not known what this was. She went back to the library and sat in the green chair and opened her book, and the fire burned quietly, and outside the January night settled over the frozen garden, and inside the house everything was very still and very full at the same time, just the way she liked it. The announcement was made in the first week of February, in the formal manner that such announcements required, through the correct channels, with the correct language, with all the social machinery of official declaration moving through its expected motions. Clara was not present when it happened, which was also correct, because this particular piece of it was the public version of something that had been real to her since November, and she had learned long ago that the public version of a real thing is not the same as the real thing itself. She let it happen in the way that official things need to happen, and went about her morning, which included breakfast, and Agnes, and a chapter of a book she was in the middle of. What she heard, afterward, from various sources and in various ways, was that the announcement had been received with a range of responses that tracked almost perfectly with what she would have predicted. Lady Alder had expressed satisfaction in a way that was clearly sincere rather than performed, which was what Clara would have expected. Several families who had been at the Grand Harvest Gala received the news in ways their expressions apparently contradicted their words, which was not what Clara would have called surprising. Mrs. Garrett at the lending library apparently stopped speaking for a full 5 seconds when the news reached her, which Agnes described with considerable relish to Clara the following morning. And there was a woman named Mrs. Holt, who had been at the gala and whose daughter had been, by all accounts, placed strategically near Edmund's initial entrance to the ballroom, who was reported to have said, when the announcement reached her, that she had always thought Clara Whitmore was a young woman of particular quality. This was so transparently at odds with every previous evidence of Mrs. Holt's opinion that it had apparently been met by the people around her with the kind of polite silence that is its own response. Clara heard all of this from Agnes, who had her networks and used them without apology, and she found it interesting in the detached way she found most social behavior interesting, as an illustration of how people operate when their positions in the world change around them. She felt no particular anger at any of it. She thought she perhaps should, and she examined that expectation honestly to make sure she was not suppressing something she was supposed to feel. But what she found, when she looked, was genuinely not anger. What she found was something more philosophical. People had behaved as their circumstances encouraged them to behave. The circumstances had changed. Their behavior was changing accordingly. This was not admirable, but it was not mysterious, and she did not find it worth her energy to be outraged by. She was far more interested in the things that were actually happening. Edmund had arranged for her to visit the house at Ashford in February, before the weather improved, which was apparently his preference, as he wanted her to see the place without the flattery of summer light. He said he thought it was important for her to see it as it actually was, and to form her own view, without the landscape doing persuasive work on his behalf. She had found this very characteristic of him. They went on a Wednesday, with her mother and Edmund's household manager, a steady and capable man named Mr. Hartley, who had been with the household for 20 years, and who looked at Clara, on first meeting, with the specific assessment of someone working out whether a person is going to make their job easier or harder, and who seemed, by the end of the morning, to have arrived at a conclusion that she found acceptable. The house at Ashford was large in the way that such houses are large, which is to say significantly larger than anything Clara had lived in, but not in the particular intimidating way she had half expected. It had clearly been lived in by serious people over a long time. The rooms were well proportioned, and light came into them cleanly. The library was twice the size of the one she had left behind, and when Edmund opened the door and stood back to let her go in first, she walked into the middle of it and turned in a slow circle and said nothing for a long moment. He waited. "It needs more philosophy," she said. "It has philosophy," he said. "More recent philosophy," she said. "Make a list," he said. She looked at him. He looked back with the particular expression that meant he was not joking. She thought about the green chair and the borrowed light and the hours she had spent building a mind in a small house in a village, while the world did its business without her, and she thought about the space in this room, which was hers now, or becoming hers, and what she might do with that space. She pulled out the small notebook she always carried and began writing. Edmund watched her from the doorway for a moment, and then came in and sat down in a chair near the window, because there was a chair near the window, and picked up a book from the table beside it, because there was a book on the table beside it, and they were both quietly in the room together, while February light came through the windows, and it was, Clara thought, a very good kind of silence. They walked the grounds in the afternoon, all four of them, though Mr. Hartley fell back at some point, and Frances was occupied with the kitchen garden in a way that suggested she was taking the visit seriously, which Clara appreciated, because it meant her mother was trying to see what she was actually looking at, rather than what she expected to see. Edmund walked beside Clara on the path that ran along the eastern side of the house, where an old stone wall separated the formal garden from the kitchen grounds, and the February light was flat and cold, and the bare branches of an old mulberry tree made their pattern against the white sky. "What do you think?" he asked. It was not a casual question. He meant it precisely. She thought about it honestly. "I think it is a place where serious people have lived seriously," she said, "and that you can feel that in the rooms. Is that good?" "For me, yes," she said. "I do not find seriousness discouraging." "I know," he said. They walked a little further. The frozen grass crunched underfoot. A bird moved in the mulberry tree above them. "I also think," she said, "that it needs someone who is going to use the library properly." "It has been waiting for someone to do that," he said. She looked at him. His expression was composed and careful, but she had learned to read the things underneath the composure, the places where his face told her something his words were not saying. What she saw there was quiet happiness. Real, private, unperformed. She turned back to the path. "I think I am going to be content here," she said. "Content," he repeated, trying the word. "Not a small word," she said. "Do not undervalue it." He thought about this. "You are right," he said. "Content is serious." "Content is very serious," she agreed. "Happy comes and goes. Content has depth." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am content when I am talking with you." "I know," she said. "So am I." They finished the walk and went in for tea, and Frances and Mr. Hartley reappeared from their various examinations of the house and grounds, and they sat in the main drawing room, which was handsome and well made, and in need of the kind of personalizing that comes from someone actually living inside a life rather than maintaining a house. Clara could see what she would do with it, and with the rooms adjacent to it, and with the library that needed more philosophy. She could see it not as decoration, but as the expression of the people who would be living in it. She could see how Edmund's seriousness and her own particular kind of seriousness would layer themselves into those rooms over time, the way the previous serious people had layered themselves into the house's bones and made it feel the way it felt. She did not share this vision in detail, because it was early, and she was careful, and she did not say things before she was sure of them, but she carried it home with her that evening, through the cold February dark in the carriage, with her mother quiet across from her, and Edmund's house behind her, and she turned it over in her mind, with the particular attention she gave to things that mattered. She thought about the corridor again. She could not stop herself thinking about the corridor sometimes, not because she was stuck there, but because it seemed to her the hinge of everything, the place where one version of her life ended and another became possible. She thought about what she had been in that corridor, not waiting, not hoping, simply there, herself, complete, with her book and her cold tea and her honest thoughts. She had not needed the gala to find something real.
Fewer.
She had not needed the gilded room, or the silk dress, or the introductions, or the careful positioning. She had needed to be exactly herself, in a corridor, and the right person had needed to walk past the whole performance to find her. She thought about her mother's comment, of hoping. Her mother had said, once, that she had warned Clara about hoping. Clara had not forgotten this, and she did not think it was bad advice, taken generally. Hope without foundation was a kind of cruelty you did to yourself, but hope that was grounded in what was actually real, in an honest assessment of an actual person and an actual situation, was not the same thing. She had been careful. She had hoped carefully, and had not let that hope get ahead of what she actually knew. And what she had come to know, over weeks and months of careful attention, was that Edmund Voss was real, in every way that mattered. His character was solid. His interest in her was not about what she could become for him, but about what she already was. His intentions, stated plainly and then backed up by everything he did, were exactly what he said they were. Careful hope, grounded in what was real, had brought her to this carriage, to this February evening, to this life that was weeks away from beginning properly. She was, she thought, in exactly the right place. The carriage pulled up outside the Whitmore house, and the cold air came in, when the door opened, and she stepped out into the night, and the house was lit up warmly from inside, and Agnes would be in the kitchen, and the library was just where she had left it. She went inside. Eleanor had sent a letter that morning from the north, a long one, full of descriptions of the countryside and Louisa's household, and something about a particular conversation she had found unexpectedly interesting. The letter had the quality of someone who was discovering things, rather than retreating from things, which was exactly what Clara had hoped to find in it. She read it again before bed, sitting in the library by the fire, and then she set it down, and sat for a while in the green chair that was coming with her when she moved, because Edmund had arranged it, because he had thought to arrange it, and she thought about letters and libraries, and the slow, patient work of becoming the person you were always going to be, if you were given the right conditions. She had made most of her conditions herself. That was also true, and she was honest enough to say it. The fire burned low. The house was quiet around her. In a few weeks, the formal arrangements would be complete, and the date would be set, and the corridor and the gray dress, and all the years before them, would become the beginning of a story, rather than the whole of it. She was ready for the beginning, to have its ending. Or rather, its continuation. She thought that was the better word. Continuation. They were married on the 14th of April, when the Whitmore garden was making its first serious attempt at spring, with the crocuses coming up at the edges of the old stone paths, and the mulberry tree at Ashford just beginning to think about its leaves. Clara chose the date herself, after considering several options Edmund had offered with the ease of someone who genuinely did not mind which one she chose. She chose April because it was the month in which the light changed properly, when the days became longer, in a way you could actually feel, not just measure. She liked beginnings that had light behind them. The ceremony was held at the church in the village, which was where the Whitmore family had attended all their lives, and which had a quality Clara valued above any grander setting, the quality of being a real place, where real people came to mark real things. It was not a large ceremony. Edmund had not wanted large, and this was one of the many places where their preferences aligned without discussion. A gathering of the people who actually mattered to both of them. His family, the quiet and serious older uncle who had helped raise him after his own parents died, and the cousin he was genuinely fond of who came from the countryside with his wife. Her family, which was her mother and Eleanor, who had come back from the north looking rested in a way that Clara noticed and was glad of. Lady Alder came. She sat in the second row with her gray eyes, steady, and something in her expression that Clara thought was very close to vindication. Agnes came. This had required some negotiation with the household about who could and could not take a morning from their duties, and Clara had made herself clear on the subject, and Agnes had sat in the pew with her hands folded and her best dress on, and had not said a word through the entire ceremony, but had produced, when Clara passed her at the door afterward, a handkerchief that was already needed. Eleanor stood beside Clara before the ceremony in the small room off the nave, where Clara had been waiting, and they did not say very much, because the situation did not require a great deal of talking. Eleanor had done Clara's hair, which was a new thing between them, a gentle thing, and she had done it beautifully, because she was Eleanor, and she was excellent at the things she turned her attention to. "You look like yourself," Eleanor said, when she was done. She said it with satisfaction, as if this were the precise goal, and had been achieved. "Good," Clara said. "That was the intention." "You are not nervous?" Eleanor asked. Clara thought about it honestly, because she always thought about things honestly. "No," she said. "I am alert. There is a difference." "What is the difference?" "Nervous is afraid of what might go wrong," Clara said. "Alert is paying attention to what is actually happening." Eleanor looked at her with the expression she had been wearing more lately, the one that was finding things that had been in front of her for years, and was only now seeing them fully. "I will remember that," she said. She went out to take her place, and Clara was alone in the small room for a few minutes, before the door would open, and the next part of her life would begin. She sat with the quiet. She thought about the gray dress, not with sadness, because it was not a sad memory anymore. It had become the beginning of the story, and beginnings, however hard, are not the same as the whole. She thought about the corridor, and the amber light, and the way Edmund had stopped when he saw her, and the question he had asked about the book, and the way she had answered it, without looking to see if the answer was welcome. She thought about her father, who had been a gentleman who read and thought and laughed. She thought he would have liked Edmund. She thought he would have found the whole story somewhat funny, in the good way, the way stories that begin in unexpected corridors are funny, when they are also true. She thought about what she had been building in the library, over all those years when no one was watching, the person she had become in the space of being overlooked, the mind she had sharpened against ideas when there was no one around to sharpen it against, the honesty she had practiced in private until it became the only way she knew how to operate. She thought about how none of that had happened in spite of being left in the hall. Some of it had happened because of it. The corridor had made her. The years before the corridor had made her. The gray dress and the cold tea and the borrowed books and the kitchen mornings with Agnes, all of it had made her, and the person those things had made was the person Edmund had walked past everyone to find. She did not romanticize the difficulty of it. She was too honest for that. She would have preferred, if given the choice, to have been seen more clearly by her family earlier, to have had more support, to have not been the one left in the hall. Those things would have been better. She would not pretend otherwise. But she had not been given that choice, and what she had been given instead was the opportunity to build herself from what was actually available, which she had done, and which had turned out to be enough. More than enough. The door opened. Her mother stood there, with the particular expression of someone who had rearranged several long-held things inside themselves, and was finding the new arrangement both unfamiliar and genuinely better. "It is time," Frances said. Clara stood. She smoothed her dress, which was ivory silk, chosen by herself and fitted for herself and belonging entirely to herself. She had not asked anyone's opinion about it except Edmund's, and his opinion had been that it suited her, which was all he had said, and all she had needed. She took her mother's arm. Frances looked at her for a moment, in the quiet of the little room, with the spring light coming through the single window. "I am proud of you," Frances said. Clara felt the warmth of it, full and real. "Thank you," she said, "and I am glad you are here." Frances pressed her lips together and squared her shoulders and led her daughter out of the room toward the door of the nave. The ceremony was simple and honest, and went exactly as ceremonies do when the people in them are present and meaning what they say. Edmund stood at the front of the church with his quiet steadiness, and when Clara came through the door he turned and looked at her with the expression she had filed away on the evening he left the drawing room for the first time, the most unguarded thing she had seen on his face. It was still unguarded, more so. She walked toward him through the church that smelled of old stone and spring air and candles, with Eleanor and Agnes and Lady Alder, and all the people who had played some part in the year that had brought her here, and she kept her eyes on Edmund, because there was nothing else in the room that mattered more than getting to the person at the end of it. She got there. They stood together and said the words that meant what they said, and meaning what you say is not a small thing. It is in fact one of the larger things, and Clara meant every word she said, with the specific and grounded honesty that she brought to everything. He meant his. She knew that because she knew him now, properly, in the way you know someone when you have spent months talking honestly and listening carefully, and watching a character hold steady under conditions that test it. She knew the way his thinking moved, and the things that made him laugh, and the things that made him serious, and the places where his certainty was solid, and the places where he was still working things out. She knew that he listened. She knew that he pushed back. She knew that he had arranged the library, and the provisions, and the green chair, and all of the invisible things, before she had said yes to the visible thing, because that was who he was. She knew she could trust him, not as an act of faith, but as a conclusion drawn from evidence. That was the only kind of trust she had ever been able to genuinely hold, and it was the best kind. The ceremony ended, and the spring light outside the church was warm and clear, and the village was quiet around them, and Edmund held her hand as they came out into it, and she did not feel swept away or overcome, or any of the things that people sometimes describe. She felt present. She felt entirely, completely present, in her own life, on her own terms, on a day she had chosen, beside a person she had come to by being herself, in a corridor on a November evening, when no one had been watching. There was a meal at a house belonging to Edmund's uncle, who was a man of warmth and simplicity who had made sure there was a great deal of good food and very little ceremony, which suited everyone. Eleanor sat next to Edmund's cousin's wife, and they appeared to be having a conversation that both found genuinely interesting. Lady Alder sat beside Francis and they talked at length, and with what appeared to be mutual satisfaction. Agnes ate 3 plates of food with the focused dedication of someone who has been cooking for other people all her life, and is finally in a position to be cooked for. Edmund sat beside Clara, which was where he sat for the rest of the afternoon and the evening, because that was where he wanted to be, and where she was, and they talked about the things they always talked about, and some new things that the day had given them, and the hours went in the way good hours go, which is faster than you expect and fuller than you planned. In the evening, when the light was going golden, and the last of the guests were in their carriages, and the house was quieting, Clara stood at the window of the sitting room at Edmund's uncle's house and looked at the garden outside, which was someone else's garden, a stranger's garden, but which had the particular quality of all gardens at the end of an April day, warm and still and smelling of earth and possibility. Edmund came to stand beside her. She did not say anything, and neither did he, for a while. Outside, the sky went deeper, and the garden went slower, and the evening settled around them, the way evenings do, when the day has been exactly what it was supposed to be. Then he said, quietly, "What are you thinking?" It was the question he always asked, the one that meant he actually wanted to know. She thought about what she was thinking, and it was many things, but the one that was closest to the surface was this. "I am thinking about the gray dress," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He had heard the story of the gray dress over the months, piece by piece, not as a complaint or a drama but simply as part of the account of how things had been, and he had listened to it the way he listened to everything, with full attention, and without requiring her to feel more or less about it than she did. "What about it?" he said. "I was thinking," she said, "that it was the right dress for the corridor. Any other dress would have been wrong." He was quiet again, but she could feel him thinking. "How so?" he said. "Because any other dress would have been a performance," she said, "and the whole point was that I wasn't performing. I was just there, being what I was, in the wrong event and the wrong dress and the wrong part of the building." She paused, and that turned out to be exactly right. He said nothing for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the quiet quality it had when he was saying something he meant completely. "You were not in the wrong part of the building," he said. "You were in the part of the building I walked into." She looked at him. His face was the same face it always was, the calm and serious face that she had been reading carefully for months, and had found to be exactly what it looked like, honest, present, hers. "Yes," she said, "that is true." They turned back to the window together. The garden was nearly dark now, the last of the light collecting at the edge of the sky, and the first stars were appearing in the blue above the trees. Clara thought about corridors, and about how what happens in them is often more important than what happens in the rooms they lead to. She thought about the years she had spent becoming who she was, in the quiet spaces where no one was looking. She thought about books, and about thinking, and about the particular dignity of a person who does not require an audience to be real. She thought about the question Edmund had asked her, months ago, standing in the corridor with the amber light and the cold tea and the philosophy essay in her hand. The very first question. The one that had started all of it. He had asked what she was disagreeing with. She had told him. And the rest, all of the rest, had followed from that single honest answer, given freely, without calculation, by a woman in a gray dress in a corridor, who had not known she was being found. She thought that was perhaps the whole story, really. All the thousands of words that had accumulated around it, all the decisions, and the arrangements, and the conversations, and the morning walks, and the kitchen visits, and the letters, and the February journey to the library at Ashford, and the spring ceremony in the village church, all of it lived inside that single moment of honesty. She had told him what she thought. He had listened. They had been doing those two things, in various forms, ever since. She intended to keep doing them for a very long time. The garden outside the window had gone fully dark now. The stars were clear. Edmund's hand was warm next to hers on the windowsill. She leaned, very slightly, toward the warmth. He did not move away. He never moved away. That was the whole thing, she thought. That was the simplest and truest way of saying it. He had found her in a corridor because she had been real in a hall full of performances. He had stayed because she kept being real. And she had let him stay because he was real in return, in all the ways that mattered, in all the ways that lasted. Everything that people call luck or destiny or fate, she thought, was in the end just two people being honest with each other, when being honest was the harder thing. She had been honest from the first sentence. So had he. And here they were. Here, at last, at the beginning of everything.